Notre Dame fans, welcome back to another edition of the Irish Breakdown Podcast. It's Wednesday, hump day, and that means Ryan Roberts, who I am joined by over there, our Director of Recruiting at Irish Breakdown, and I'm Brian Driscoll. We are here to talk Notre Dame Marshall. We have turned the page on last week's game, and we are ready to focus on the next game. And as we said yesterday, Ryan, we are going to learn a lot about Notre Dame this weekend, and we'll dive into more of that in our writing at irishbreakdown.com and in some of our other discussions. But today, we're going to kind of dive into some analysis of this matchup, and we're going to look at how these two teams stack up on paper and how they stack up. And I think when you look at Marshall specifically, Ryan, kind of before we dive into the specifics of that team, I think the big picture thing that I like about this matchup is I think that Marshall is exactly the kind of team that Notre Dame needs to play a week after Ohio State. And what I mean by that is it's a game you're highly likely to win. Mm-hmm. It's also not a cakewalk team. Like, I don't want to play some FCS team because I feel like you're not going to really learn enough about how you've responded. Your body language could be bad. Your execution could be bad. You could not make any of the improvements you need to make. And if you play the same way you did against Ohio State against some teams, UNLV, for example, you're still going to stomp them, and you're not going to learn anything. I feel like with Marshall, kind of like Toledo last year, if you try and sleepwalk through this game, they're going to jump up and bite you. I think they're also good enough in some specific areas that we'll kind of get into during the show that are going to test Notre Dame to see just how much you've improved. So I think the timing of this Marshall game is going to end up being something that's definitely a positive for Notre Dame.
And I think that you're going to see a lot of the same qualities on the schedule that get you worried at some points, right? Like, you're going to see for Marshall, not diving too much into it, but you're going to see some perimeter ability from their wide receivers. You're going to see the ability to work in space. You're going to see some good defensive players, if I'm being completely honest, and you're going to see some size at the offensive line, right? So I agree, Brian. I mean, I commented on it yesterday that I think there's several players in this Marshall team that are probably better than what we would typically think of as Marshall level players. Like, I think there's a couple that can play decently high level of football. So I'm looking forward to it, man, because again, it's not a cupcake. It's not a cakewalk. Notre Dame needs to come out and play hard, or else Marshall's going to be able to keep it close for a little bit, I think. Ultimately, they're just so much more talented that they should win this one relatively easy, but Notre Dame needs to show that they have a little bit of that gut check moments. And it's kind of like, hey, man, yes, last week stunk. It stinks to lose a close game, but hey, let's come back and let's give our A game this next week. That's big.
Because ultimately, Ryan, that's what matters most about this matchup with Marshall. It's not so much the win, because they'll win. It's not so much about the margin of victory. It's not so much about a lot of the different aspects that we've talked about. It's about, I think you nailed it. It's about, okay, how are you going to respond, right? And I'm going to have my midweek musings coming out here after the show at some point in time. It'll come out later this afternoon. And, one of the themes from it is we're going to learn a lot about this Notre Dame football team this week. We're going to learn a lot about them from the standpoint of, what kind of character do they have as a football team? What kind of leadership do they have from a coaching standpoint? What kind of leadership do they have from a player standpoint? What is this team made of? Because what this team is made of is going to tell us how much they're able to come out and play to their potential, because I don't expect the team to be full throttle in week 2. I mean, that does take time. I mean, there's a reason why some teams have looked really bad in September, or not, maybe not as good in September. Clemson in 2018, that team that we've talked about was so good. They weren't that good in the first 4 or 5 games of the year. They were good, but they didn't look like the team that they were in November, and then, of course, in the playoff, because they were a young team that was still evolving as a team. And now this is not a young team per se, at least it's not on defense, but the offense is a young team. You have a sophomore quarterback. You have 2 sophomore running backs as part of your 3-man rotation. Your top receiver is a sophomore. You have 2 sophomores starting the offensive line. Now, that's not an excuse for how you played on Saturday. right? Because you're the starters. It's just pointing to the fact of it's not a justification for why you're losing, but it is saying it is going to take you a little time to reach your peak, right? And so, but what do you do as a young offense, for example? Because we're going to start off with the offensive conversation here first. But what do you do as an offense from a leadership standpoint? You know, if Jarrett Patterson can't go, Avery Davis isn't on your team now. Who steps up as that leader and says, "Hey, you know what? What we did Saturday, not good enough. It's not on Coach Reese. It's not on Coach Freeman. It's not on Coach Easton. It's on us." Right? And that's what you want to see. Now, we could sit there and argue around, well, no, the coaches are ultimately responsible. They're the coaches. That's how you and I look at it because we are former coaches. But I want to see that leadership from the players say, fellas, no. We don't need Coach Reese to put his foot up our butts. Who's the offensive lineman? Is it Josh Lugg? Is it Zeke Correll? Is it Andrew Kristofic? Who, if Jarrett Patterson can't play, says, hey, no. We don't need Coach Easton to rip our butts today. We should be more pissed about our performance than he is, right? That's the character that I want to see from this football team. And if they're going to bounce back from this game in a way, Ryan, that kind of tells us, okay, this team's got a little something, we're gonna see that. And that's really the thing that I'm most looking forward to seeing on Saturday is as we we'll dive into the matchups and we'll get into all the specifics of this matchup or that matchup or whatever the case may be. But that's the thing right now, more than anything, Ryan, that's that you can't quantify with the statistic. And you're not going to be able to quantify it afterwards with a statistic because you are the far superior team. It's going to be about just watching the game and being like, okay, this team played with a little bit of an edge today, and that tells me something about Notre Dame.
It's what we call self-accountability, man. We need to see these guys kind of take that onus on themselves. I agree with you completely, Brian, because this is one of those things where I think we remembered, was it last week or the week before? I can't remember. I talked a little bit about Kyron Williams was kind of that spark, right? Like he was kind of that emotional leader. You kind of fed off him if you're Notre Dame offensive player and Notre Dame defensive player for that matter. Who's that guy on this team right now? I think there's a few guys that can be that guy, but as of right now, I'm still kind of waiting to see like who is that leader on both sides of the ball that they're just, he walks in the room, he tells you to get your stuff together and you get your stuff together. Like that is the difference, the tone setter, if you want to call him that. And this game, it can be tough. This type of game can be tough because whether it's drilled into them every single day throughout the week, which I'm sure it will be, it's still, you're at Notre Dame and you're playing a Marshall team, right?
Yep.
Where you're going to look at them and you're going to say, in your minds, even if it's not on the top of your mind, even if it's not consciously, you're going to think, I'm a better football player than them, right?
Yeah.
We're a better football team than that team. We have all that understanding. And you can go into that game, and I think you can take people for granted, obviously, right? And we've already mentioned it. Marshall has some good football players, and you can't take them for granted. I think what does help Notre Dame, though, Brian, in my opinion, is that sometimes these scrappy teams do not have the guys that look the part, at times, and they kind of take you off guard. Marshall has some guys that look the part, like Corey Gabbage is 6'4", 220-pound wide receiver. Ethan Driscoll, great last name, by the way, is 6'9", 314 pounds, right? Like, Isaiah Foskey's going to line up against Ethan Driscoll and be like, oh, okay, like that's
I better
that's
bring my
offensive lineman. Yeah, that's a Division I offensive lineman. I need to play hard here.
Right.
Corey Gammage is going to line up across from Cam Hart and be like, oh, okay, yeah, I actually kind of need to play here today, right? So I think there's going to be kind of a remembering factor for this team that's like, oh, well, wait, no, this team's pretty good. Like, we're not playing just a rollover cupcake. Like, this team has Division I players, they have good football players, and they have guys that look the part. So looking forward to it, man. I am, because I look forward to every single game day as a fan and as an analyst, but I'm looking forward to this one because I said it yesterday. It's a gut check, man. It is. Like, Notre Dame could easily walk into this game if you don't have great leadership and just kind of mail it in and just be like, we're just going to do the minimum to win this football game. But I don't think that's what these coaches, I don't think that's what is on this coaching staff. I don't think it's what's on this team. And if they are the team that we think that they can be, because again, no moral victories, right? Notre Dame lost the football game against Ohio State, and they need to win that football game. There's no moral victories to that.
Could have won.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. The one silver lining is that that you can compete with that team. You know that you belong there.
Ryan, there are past Notre Dame teams that if they'd have played against a team like Ohio State the way that team played, they'd have got blown out, which again speaks to this team has more talent than people realize. They had to I mean, they made plays on Saturday based on really good scheme defensively, but also some talent. And, that's a thing that we're going to have to find out. So, Ryan, let's dive into our stacking up.
Let's do it.
So this is a breakdown that we do where we kind of look at where Notre Dame is statistically and strong, and we'll kind of look big picture games and then dive into the weeds a little bit of each individual game, and see who has the advantage in the run game. So Notre Dame's rush offense against Marshall's rush defense, in the pass game, and then overall scoring. Then we'll go defensively, and we'll kind of talk about why those things are, and we'll try to point out some, hey, this statistic is representative of what they do, or maybe this one isn't, because of whatever circumstances, and we'll try to give you as much context as we can, and then just kind of figure out who has the advantage. So it's a more of an on paper matchup, but obviously you have to take the context of who the production was against when you look at statistics like this. Usually for the first 3 games of the year, I will use last year's statistics as a gauge. Otherwise, Marshall has the advantage in every single statistic over Notre Dame if we look at one game, whereas Notre Dame played Ohio State and Marshall played Norfolk State. So it's still too early to kind of use this year's statistics as what we bring up. So it can get a little tricky because you're using last year's statistics and it's not the same teams, but we'll try to give as much context as we can to these conversations. And so that's what we're going to begin with, Ryan. And we are going to start with the Notre Dame. So actually, let's kind of start with the scoring offense for Notre Dame. We're going to kind of go in a little bit different order today because I think this is an interesting one for me, Ryan.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Because when I look at this matchup and I look at Marshall and I look at Notre Dame, I think one of the things that people are going to look at in this game and evaluate Notre Dame and evaluate Marshall, if we're being honest, you and I said yesterday, it's not about the stats, right? And it's not for me. It really isn't. But it is going to be in a lot of a perception standpoint. And I don't particularly like it. I don't like the moral victory thing. But if we're going to take a step back from what our standard is for Notre Dame and look at what the perceived standard is for Notre Dame, Notre Dame gained bonus points in some people's eyes by playing Ohio State as tough as they did. Yep. So now you go out and you look at it from a perception standpoint, and you are playing a Sun Belt team. Mm-hmm. It's a good Sun Belt team, but not an elite Sun Belt team. This isn't Louisiana Lafayette. This isn't, App State from a few years ago. This isn't one of those type of teams. Remember when Southern Miss had a couple really good teams under Larry Fedora? It's not that kind of team. And so it's a game that you're expected to dominate. And Notre Dame will not do that if the offense doesn't come to play. Because you have an article at Irish Breakdown today, and you kind of break down the individual players of each team. Your defensive one just came out about 17 minutes ago, just published about 17 minutes ago. And the thing that you said is this defense for Marshall is where you're going to find most of the, that dude can play type of guys. Mm-hmm. And so Notre Dame is going to have to come out fired up and ready to execute to do what they need to do against a team like this, because I want to learn what kind of football character Notre Dame has. And in this area right here is where we're going to see a lot of that, third down offense, red zone offense. Numbers where Notre Dame was okay last year, bad against Ohio State. 3 of 13 on third down. Couldn't move the chains. That's what hurt you. And, got into the red zone, first drive of the game, and did nothing. Lost yards. And so those are the things that you need to see. Now, they did a good job not turning the ball over, but it's because they were so conservative, in my opinion. So this right here, this matchup right here, because I think that 44 ranking, the 23.8 points per game for Marshall, is a little bit misleading. And the reason I think it's misleading is because of the league that they played in last year. They played in a league where people scored a lot of points. That 23.8 points per game, which ranked them 44th in the nation, was second in Conference USA last year. Mm-hmm. That's a league that has a lot of teams that can score points. And so I think Notre Dame needs to be they need to be able to score on that team. And that's why this matchup is so intriguing. On paper, Ryan, it's advantage Notre Dame, but as you can see, some of the statistics are very similar. You look at yards per play. Marshall's defense was better than Notre Dame's offense last year. Notre Dame didn't show us anything on Saturday against Ohio State that should make us think that all of a sudden they're going to be more explosive. They got to show it, right? We've been saying that all summer. Red zone, Notre Dame was better, in touchdown percentage, but Marshall was better just overall. Third down defense, exactly the same. Turnovers, almost identical. So this is an area where Notre Dame is going to have to show that it is improved, and this is the matchup they're going to have to make it happen against, because this is a an athletic Marshall defense that is going to make you have to execute in order to have some success against them.
You know, the number that pops out to me, Brian, I mean, you already talked about, kind of the third down percentage and the red zone percentage a little bit, but the yards per play percentage is pretty good on a Marshall side of things. Only 5.1 yards per play. That's comparative to 396 yards per game, which is only 81st nationally. Those are some of the stats right there. Cause like in my immediate thought is like, those things don't kind of fit together, right? It's like, you're not giving up a lot of yards per play, but you're giving up a lot of yards per game. That probably tells me that there was maybe a time of possession issue. Maybe that opponent's offenses had the football a little bit more.
You'll find out here in a second when we get to
Yes.
Marshall's offense. They ranked 126 in the nation in turnovers.
Oh,
that's why they gave up the kind of points that they gave up relative to what you said, like you said, the yards per play. Yes, which then put them behind in a lot of games, which led to, yes, some of those other things. But yes, it is 25 lost turnovers last year, which ranked 126th.
That's absolutely gross. Because I mean, if you look at it again, if I'm looking at a defense that in this conference only let up 5.1 yards per play, that tells me that there's some good stuff that's happening on the defensive side of the football for Marshall. I mean, again, it's 26 nationally, so it's a good place to be. But the fact that the yards per game and the points per game is up, again, would tell me that the defense was probably on the field a lot last year, right? So that's the context of these types of stats. And then, again, red zone defense was nice. We talked about Notre Dame needs to finish in the end zone. They need to finish in the red zone. That's a big advantage when you have a quarterback that has the rushing ability of a Tyler Buckner is in the red zone. That especially becomes a huge threat, the ability to run the football, because you're going to see a lot of man coverage near the end zone, right? So that could be a huge advantage point. But I mean, I think that these numbers do indicate to me, Brian, and again, there's some numbers that do not match, that's circumstantial, but Marshall has some talented players. They do on this defense, man, especially on this. I keep talking about the second level, but like these three linebackers that they have, folks, these guys can play. I'm telling you right now, you're going to see 7, you're going to see 24, and you're going to see number 1 on the field for Marshall, and you're going to be like, oh, okay. Like they can play. They're not just a pushover. They're not a rollover. So yes, I think that indicates that this is not just going to be a cakewalk. Notre Dame's offense has to come to play, and they have to really get into a good groove early against Marshall.
Well, and what you and I talked about yesterday too, Ryan, is this isn't your typical. They're not a big defense, but they're not your typical undersized Conference USA type of team, which is what they were up until this year. They're Sun Belt now, but they were Conference USA coming into the season. Like I said, they're not huge, but their defensive tackles are bigger than Notre Dame's defensive tackles at 294 and 303. Their ends are 240 and 235, but they're long. They have a young kid from Nigeria that's 6'7", 270 playing defensive end. He's their version of Alexander Ahrensberger. Elijah Austin is 6'3", 265. I mean, so they got some guys that can play, and their linebackers are rangy. They're 225, 235-pound guys that can run inside.
Yep.
So, and then Charlie Gray, as you broke down yesterday, is a 6'3", long, rangy type of kid as well. So they're really 4-3 personnel. He's more of a linebacker to me than he is like he's more Jack Kaiser than he is, like when Mike Elko was at Wake Forest and he had Thomas Brown playing Rover, who was like a big safety. This kid is more of a rangy linebacker, like a Jack Kaiser, like a Drew Tranquil kind of player, a little bit rangier, like as a little bit more of a comfortable space player than Drew was, but you get the point of he's not a Jeremiah Owusu-Koramoah as much as he's those other type of guys.
Right.
And so they're going to be prepared to shut down Notre Dame's run game. And that's going to be a part of what we're doing. So let's bring that up next, Ryan. And this is the matchup of bad on bad. And look, until Notre Dame proves us otherwise, here's the thing. Like, we talked a lot this offseason about how we expect this Notre Dame offensive line to be a lot better, and we expect the run game to be a lot better. And I think the offensive line did show improvement. It did, if you're being objective and honest. It did not look like last year's group that just was kind of passive, I guess is the way I want to say it. They weren't effective, though. And at the end of the day, I'm not giving you brownie points for getting after it. It's about execution. And they didn't execute, and they only rushed for 76 yards a game. Or 76 yards in the first game. And you're going against a Marshall team that's just last year was not able to stop the run at all. And which is surprising when you look at the talent, to be honest with you. And part of me believes I don't think that they necessarily, I'm trying to think of the right way to say this without it coming across disrespectful. I don't think that the scheme per se necessarily maximizes the talent that they have, if
Yeah.
that makes sense.
Accentuates their strengths.
It
Yes,
doesn't.
I
Yeah,
agree.
I
Yeah.
don't think that it does. And so we don't know. I mean, I thought I saw some changes. You're also now going into year 2 of Lance Guidry being your defensive coordinator. So, you'd expect a little bit better execution. As you also saw too, Ryan, is their yards per attempt was better. But my concern, if I'm looking at this from a Marshall standpoint, is you ranked 105th in rushing yards allowed, but ranked 23rd in tackles for loss. So for you to rank that high in yards and creating negatives, and yet you still gave up 192 rushing yards a game, that means when teams were running on you, they were either going -3 or gashing you.
Yes.
And so that needs to be what Notre Dame does, if we're going to be honest about it. It needs to be who they are in this game. They need to come out and they need to gash them. They need to gash Marshall. And, I don't think any of us know really what Marshall is right now on run defense, because they look great on stats. They gave up 30 yards rushing on 31 carries against a not very good team last week. So I don't know if they are improved or not, to be completely honest with you. I thought they were pretty assignment sound against Norfolk State. But again, Norfolk State was kind of a little bit dull offensively, if I'm being honest with you. I don't think they did a lot of things to really challenge Marshall. They just tried to do what they do.
Yep.
So I don't know how much improved they are, but if we're just using the one game statistic of 2022, it's advantage Marshall, but that's why you try to bring in last year is Notre Dame wasn't real good running the football last year. Marshall wasn't really good at stopping a run last year. But I think that bottom number for me is the most troubling for Notre Dame, because the tackles for loss allowed thing kind of reared its ugly head a little bit again against Ohio State. You gave up 10. Yeah, I mean, so I'm trying. Hold on. Let me look at the number. I was looking at Marshall there real quick. You gave up 6 tackles for loss against Ohio State, and you only ran the ball 30 times.
It's not great,
right? That's not good.
Yeah.
And then Marshall, on the other hand, had 10 tackles for loss in their opener against Norfolk State, which tracks with how they were last year. So that's the concern for me. Is Notre Dame should be able to have its way against Marshall if they're good. They should. I mean, but if they play as unsound in their execution as they did last week against Ohio State, you're going to see this number down here, right here, become problematic, because it's going to put Notre Dame behind the sticks and force them to throw. And I don't care who you're playing. You don't want to be in situations right now where you have to throw because you have no choice. That's never a great place to be in if the team on the other side has a pulse. And this is the thing about this matchup that makes it very interesting, Ryan.
Well, I think the one thing that you did see that is consistent with what last year Marshall, as far as Marshall's game against Norfolk State, Brian, is these stats tell me that this is a very boomer bust run stopping defense, right? This is a very aggressive run stopping defense, because either they're going to make a tackle for loss, or like you said, they're probably giving up a pretty big game, right? They're giving up some explosive plays in the run game. And I think even though it didn't hurt them on the stat sheet against Norfolk State, I still think that you saw the over aggressiveness at times, right? Like I wrote in the piece that just went live that I thought Charlie Gray is a talented, kind of overhang Sam type of defender, but even he's kind of over aggressive a little bit, like I said that you can toy with him a little bit, right? Like you can make him guess wrong. And I think that there is a lot of guessing in the talented linebackers that they have in the defense that they run. I mean, Abraham Beauplan is going to take some chances, right? Like Eli Neal is going to take some chances. Charlie Gray is going to take some chances. These guys are going to go for the big plays. There's no doubt about it. Last week, it didn't hurt them because they didn't play against a great team. But I think that does track to last season, Brian, is the fact that this is an aggressive defense. They're going to the thing I like about these linebackers a ton is that they hit their trigger step and they get downhill in a hurry. They will go, right? And I think that is a big indicator of why that tackle for loss number is so high. But they also maybe put themselves in a bad position in a lot of reps too, right? So I think that kind of tracks what we saw last season. Because again, folks, if you watched just a little bit of the Norfolk State game, a lot of plays that they made, but also some misses still. It's just against Norfolk State, it's not going to hurt you as much as it is against a good team that you're going to play on your schedule.
And that, to me, Ryan, is why I think this is a good test for Notre Dame. Right? This is what we're talking about, right? Like, because of how they play, you're going to have a better idea of where you are. Now, look, there's a scenario in which Notre Dame could rush for over 200 yards, and you and I come and sit down here in the post-game show and say, I'm concerned. Actually, you won't be on the post-game show this week, but when we talk breakdowns next week, getting ready for Cal, say, look, I'm still concerned. Yes, they rushed for 225 yards, but Chris Tyree had a 50-yard run, Tyler Buckner had a 40-yard run. You still gave up 8 tackles for loss against Marshall, right? And you were able to overwhelm them with talent. And that's not what I want. I don't want to see Notre Dame overwhelm Marshall with talent, because that doesn't mean you're better. I want to see them overwhelm Marshall with talent, with technique, with toughness, and with execution. That's what we're talking about here, right? Like when they beat New Mexico 66-10, I wasn't impressed with that game. You could see clear flaws with that football team because they just overwhelmed them with talent. And I don't want to see them overwhelm them with talent. And that's the whole point that I'm trying to make, is I want to see them overwhelm them with all the other aspects of it. That's what I want to see from this Notre Dame football team. And that right there, if they can keep the tackles for loss way down, that's a sign that this unit learned from its mistakes against Ohio State and they're playing more sound football. Then a game in which they maybe rushed for 225 yards is more impressive to me because it was done with execution, not just overwhelming an inferior opponent. And that's why, again, I say this is a good matchup for Notre Dame, because it's going to force you to learn from your mistakes, and it'll be easier to see, okay, did you just overwhelm them with talent or did you play better? Yeah. And that's the point. Because if they play the same exact way they did against Ohio State, they will win this game by 2 touchdowns.
Oh, for sure.
At least. At least.
I was going to say, it might even be a little higher, but I think the over-encompassing thing, though, Brian, to what you said, is that you need to see that growth. Because how Notre Dame is built, you need to be successful in early downs. You need to run the football successfully. You can't have negative plays because you're going to put yourself behind the chains, and you are a team that wants to establish the run and let things work off of the run. That's how you want to make your money. Like, that's what you do, right? And that's going to create explosive plays. That's going to open up play action and opportunities that way. So even past Marshall for a second, Notre Dame needs to be better and not give up any negative plays, because they're the type of team, as a run-first team, that needs to play in front of the chains. They can't fall behind, or else they're just not going to be nearly as effective. So I think that's a more of an all-encompassing thing, but I agree completely. In this game, that's what I need to see that. Like, if the Notre Dame's offensive line comes out and they aren't able to dominate a Marshall defensive line, but I'll just put it out there, that's going to be very troubling.
Yes.
Very troubling, because they're better. Look, in a few weeks, you're going to be playing against Brian Bresee, Miles Murphy, and Tyler Davis, and KJ Henry in that group, right? If you can't dominate a Marshall defensive line, you sure as heck are not going to do it when you play against your next biggest competition in Clemson, right? Like, it's not going to happen. So all-encompassing, but it's specifically in this game as well, Notre Dame needs to dominate from an offensive line perspective and create some movement in the run game. It has to happen.
Right. Let's go here to the passing offense. This is an intriguing matchup because on paper, Marshall was a really good pass defense last year on paper. My question for you, Ryan, is I don't know how good they actually were in pass defense last year. And I actually question how good they were in pass defense last year, because when you look at it, they had a couple games where they padded their numbers a little bit. Right. And so they, kept Navy had 61 yards. NC Central had 106 yards. And it was they had some really strange stat lines. They held Middle Tennessee State to 105 yards. They held Old Dominion to 106 yards. And you're like, that seems to be pretty good, right? I mean, that's keeping those teams way down. But then you actually go look at those teams and you're like, yeah, okay, these teams weren't very good throwing the football last year. So for example, as I said, they held North Texas to 134 yards last year. Well, North Texas had more interceptions last year than they had touchdown passes.
You just mentioned Old Dominion as well. If anybody saw their first game against Virginia Tech, I mean, Old Dominion went 14 of 37 passing. So you're not playing against very good passing offense.
And last year they were 15 touchdowns and 14 interceptions, right? Yeah. I mean, so, not a team that throws the ball a ton last year. So then you have games like against East Carolina, who was a better passing team last year, and they gave up 395 yards. They give up 283 to App State. Teams that are more effective throwing the football. But then you look and say, okay, well, they gave up 328 to Western Kentucky, but as we pointed out yesterday, that was actually keeping Western Kentucky well below their season average. So It was really a strange season for them with the pass defense, because again, against East Carolina, they underachieved against App State. Now, the other part of the Western Kentucky game is I believe Western Kentucky got on them pretty early and, didn't exactly, they ran. Western Kentucky ran 34 times in that game last year. That was the most times they'd rushed. That was the most rushing attempts they had all year. They also rushed for 157 yards that game, which is the most rushing yards they had all year in the regular season. So they jumped on them early, and that's kind of plays into why those numbers were a little bit down. And then, of course, Louisiana goes out and passes for, I think, was it like 286? Let me pull back up here real quick. 278. Louisiana Lafayette wasn't really a vaunted passing team. They only had 218.5 yards per game. So they were an efficient passing team, but not a real explosive passing team. And you gave up 278. So I don't think this is a very good pass defense, which is interesting, Ryan, because they have some pretty good athletes on the back end of their defense, and they're very long. They weren't schematically. There were some things that created some problems for them last year, in my opinion. And I'm curious to see how they've been able to correct those, if they can, this season.
Yeah, this is another unit that I thought was a little bit feast or famine, right? Because you see some of those numbers, like the yards per attempt, 10th nationally, 6.3 yards per attempt. That's a great number. Only 18 touchdowns. The yards per game numbers low. There's a lot of really good numbers on that list. But you say it again, Brian, like for context purposes, you have to look at what are they doing against the better passing teams on the schedule, what were they doing against some of the worst passing teams on the schedule. Like those the context does matter. Also had 40 sacks, which is a pretty decent number. So on paper, it looks like a pretty good pass defense. But I agree with you. I think that you're missing some of the context there, and I'm curious to see, because Notre Dame has a lot of questions to answer from a passing game perspective, right? Like after game one, but Marshall has some good football players. Stephen Gilmore is a really good corner who I think is going to get a shot in the NFL. Like he's a good football player, and they got a couple of those guys in the back end that I would call, longer athletes than what you would consider a typical Marshall defensive back. So interested to see it. And obviously this is the one I think that Notre Dame fans are going to be paying most attention to, in my opinion, right? They want to see, I know I do, if I'm just talking personally, I don't want to see Notre Dame just run the football in a super high volume clip because they can, right? I expect that to happen. I want to see the training wheels come off a little bit. I want to see what they can do as a passing offense. I want to see what they can do if they open things up a little bit. So I'm interested, because not only is that what I think Notre Dame is potentially going to do, or what they should do, you're also playing against a passing defense that had some good moments, but also you have the clear advantage of, right? So I think that you have the advantage here. It's just, you have to see it. Right. Notre Dame just threw for 177 yards or something like that, right? Like somewhere in that ballpark. So this is going to be a test, because it's not a terrible pass defense, but I think Notre Dame does have the advantage. It's just about doing it now.
I think this is a good test for the receivers. I do. I like this test for the receivers because, as you said, this is going to be a long group of defensive backs. If Lance Guidry has half a brain, and I think that he does, he's going to watch Notre Dame's game against Ohio State. He's going to watch them against Purdue last year, against Cincinnati last year, against Oklahoma State last year. And he's going to say, what was the common theme? When you come up and you get aggressive with these receivers, they don't play well. And that's what I'm going to do. I'm not going to stay off and let Lorenzo Styles and Braden Lindsey and those guys just eat me up with RPOs, because I'm afraid of Notre Dame. You've got nothing to lose here. Come up and be aggressive and try to force them into mistakes. That's going to be the key, because they are pretty decent at getting after the quarterback. They are. And they do some things schematically that try to free up rushers. And that's what Notre Dame struggled with last week. So if I'm Marshall, I'm coming at Notre Dame real aggressively with my pressures and aggressive with my coverages. And Notre Dame has to anticipate that. Now, on film, Ryan, you do see a lot of that into the boundary on film, not as much to the field. I'm curious if they're going to adjust that on Saturday and kind of do some more cover one type of stuff, because they have to. If you're Marshall, you also have to know. Okay, I know coaching. I know Notre Dame, and I know Harry Heastan. I don't have to know them personally to know that they're not going to be real happy with what happened on Saturday, and they're going to try to run the football. We can't let them run down our throat. We weren't very good at it last year anyway. So, what is the way you can commit extra resources? Play more quarters. you could do that, sure, but then Notre Dame's going to RPO you and quick game you to death and screen game you to death on the perimeter, and you don't necessarily want that. Or the other option is to kind of go 8 in the box and go kind of cover 1 on the outside and say we're going to take our chances and make Notre Dame beat us down the field. Because what's the one thing Notre Dame hasn't proven a lot in the last few years? That they can beat you consistently throwing the ball down the field. And so if I'm Marshall, that's what I'm going to try to force Notre Dame to do. And if you're Notre Dame, you got to step up and answer to the bell. And, so get more crossers, get more levels, get more, climb routes across the field, get more your perimeter screen game going, and then take some shots, because if you can bang a deep shot early against Marshall, whether it's designed, with a, some kind of climb, some kind of post, some kind of wheel, if you can design a deep shot that way, that's great. Or if you just line up and they're like, okay, they're playing cover 1, let's take a shot, and you bang that. Okay, whatever, however you get to it, that's the thing that's going to back Marshall off. If you can hit a couple shots down the field early in the game, and I don't mean just straight go routes too. I'm talking like a 20, 25 yard, drag or deep in. Those are down the field shots also of what I'm talking about on top of deep shots. I think those are the things to me that I want to see from this pass game this weekend. And we'll dive a little bit more into some of the specifics of it next weekend. But I think specific to this matchup, Ryan, is if they can come out early and establish the pass, I think that's going to be something this team needs from a confidence and run game is what they need from a confidence standpoint. Pass game, they need to get the timing better. The timing was off against Ohio State. There was stuff there, but the timing was off. And they need to get the timing down. And that takes time and it takes opportunity. And that's why I want to see them come out and be a little bit aggressive throwing the ball because, again, you can just bully Marshall. You can just bully Marshall if you want. But bullying Marshall doesn't necessarily make your football team better as you're going to get ready to play Carolina in a couple weeks and BYU in a month and then Clemson down the road. Doesn't make you better. Get your pass game going schematically, timing-wise, protection-wise, all that. And that's why I hope that you see that from Notre Dame on Saturday. And if they can, then you've now beaten Marshall at what they do best. And that's something that I'm going to look for on Saturday.
And it's a confidence boost, too. I mean, I feel like we've talked a lot about the fact that you have a sophomore quarterback who just made his first career start, but you also have a bunch of sophomore receivers playing football right now. You have Braden Lindsey, who has suffered in the past from confidence issues. I mean, let's call it what it is. He needs a confidence boost. This team Joe Wilkins just coming back from an injury. I know he only played, I think, 1 or 2 plays during the first game.
And he kind of limped off after that one play. Yeah.
100%. So those guys, even your veterans working all the way down to your young receivers, those guys all need a confidence boost in this game. They do. Lorenzo Styles needs to be targeted more. He needs to build the confidence. Braden Lindsey needs to make a couple more plays than he did last week to really start building that confidence. You need to get guys like Jayden Thomas involved in the football game. You need to get those guys involved because this is a big moment, I think, Brian, honestly. People are going to kind of glance over, it's just Marshall. A lot of confidence can come out of this game.
Yes.
And I think the biggest confidence that can come out of this game is not only just the offensive line in general and getting the run game going, but passing offense. Like you mentioned, the timing was off. You saw some struggles and you saw some frustration at times. Let's call it what it is, right? This is a game where you can get Buckner in a groove. You can get the wide receivers in a groove. You can start building that chemistry further and further. That's what I want to see in this game more than anything, honestly, is for this passing attack to start to grow within itself and to get comfortable. If they start getting comfortable, we've talked about it, right? Athletes, there's a lot of athletes on this offense. There's a lot of athletes on this team. What does an athlete need in order to be a very good football player? They need confidence, man.
Right. Get
confidence injected into this passing offense, and let's see what they look like rolling into a Clemson, a BYU, a USC. I just want to see them play a lot more confidently than they did last week.
Yeah. Jonathan Garbick said this, Ryan, and I think this is a good point that ties into what we're talking about. He said between the run game and pass game, it's a question. Which one needs to be improved faster and why? Now, we're going to have a mailbag at the end, but I wanted to pull this one up because I think it's very relevant to what we're discussing right now.
Yep.
And Jonathan, my point, the point I'm trying to make in this is I do think it's the pass game because Notre Dame's heart and soul is going to be running the football. It is. If they're going to win a championship this year or compete for a championship this year or compete for and win a championship next year or the next year, it's going to be because they're one of the better running teams in the country. However, you can't just be a running team that has a pass offense that just complements you. You need a pass offense that is a legitimate threat. That's the only way you can win today. You can't, and that's what, like when you look at last year with Georgia, look, the better Stetson Bennett got later in the year, the harder it was to beat him, because if you tried to load the box, you just throw it over your head and take shots down the field. And again, you can't look at the Georgia model. Georgia's the anomaly, right? They're not the team. They're not the way that most teams do it. If you're going to produce a defense that has 13, draft picks on it, sure, okay, maybe you can do that. But most teams can't do that, right? Bama can't do that. Ohio State can't do that. And I'm talking about 13 draft picks that are in your lineup now playing like draft picks. I'm not talking about like a freshman who's eventually going to be a draft pick. I'm talking about dudes like that. I mean, if every kid on Georgia's defense would have been able to go pro last year, their 15 draft picks might have been just defensive players. I mean, I'm being serious. I'm not being hyperbolic there, because how many defensive players did they get drafted last year? Keely Ringo would have got drafted. Jalen Carter would have got drafted. Nolan Smith would have got drafted. Robert Beal, if he checks out on the medicals, probably gets drafted late, 6th, 7th round, or at least could have maybe been picked. So you get the point that I'm making here. And so to me, Ryan, it's the pass game. The pass game has to prove to be a legitimate threat, because as Bill Walsh pointed out earlier, teams are going to make you beat them throwing the football. They just are. Notre Dame we've been talking about that all offseason. They have to know that. I'm pretty confident that Tommy Rees knows that. Coach Freeman needs to understand that too, is teams are going to say, we're not going to let you beat us running the football. We're just not.
Yeah.
And Notre Dame has to be able to come out and say, okay, we're going to come out and just say, let's get our pass game really rolling. Because once the pass game gets going and then teams start having to be more balanced with their box points or box numbers, then that's when you become a really dangerous offense running the football. So I know it's normally, establish the run and all that, and that's fine. You can establish the run. But if you just come out this week and run for 350 yards and throw for 165, unless that 150 of those 165 come in the first half, you know what I mean? Like where Tyler just rips them up in the first half and then he doesn't play the rest of the half. Oh, he was on pace for 300, but they just didn't throw anymore. Okay, that's a different story, right? But for the most part, barring that sort of unique context, I need to see them throw the ball effectively. I don't need to see them throw it 50 times. They just got to be good at it, and effective at it, and doing it with a lot of different things, not just throwing a bubble screen and you just better than their dudes and you're running for 50 yards. I'm talking about making your progressions, getting the ball down the field, hitting your second guys getting open with their routes, gaining separation with their technique. I need to start seeing that stuff, Ryan, because if we don't, then maybe they're good enough to beat Carolina and BYU just on talent. And I think that they are. But we're going to see the same thing happen against Clemson that happened against Ohio State. You're going to struggle moving the football. You're going to see the same thing happen if you're fortunate enough to get into the postseason in a big game or a playoff game. Same thing's going to happen. And so until that gets fixed, then some of this other stuff isn't going to change a whole lot. You're just going to out-talent people, and it's going to be the same old story. You went 10-2. It's a great year. Yeah, you just had better athletes than everybody else. You weren't actually a great team.
Right.
And that's what last year's team was. 11-1, sure. Wasn't a very good team. That team wasn't as impressive to me as the 9-3 team from 2017 that played a much tougher schedule. Right. And so that's what I want to see, Ryan. And it's going to start right here with the pass offense to me.
Well, I think it goes hand in hand too. It's like, do you want the passing offense, the running offense to get better? Well, if your passing offense gets better, that your running offense is also going to get better because you get less boxes, or you get less numbers in the box, like you kind of illustrated as well. I would also say this, Brian. I mean, to be a good passing offense, you need more moving parts than just a running offense, right? Because I could argue that right now, if Notre Dame was better just on the offensive line, they would be a better rushing attack. Because I think running back is a very situationally dependent thing, right? Like it's nice to have that stud, but you can get by with a good running game if you just have guys that know this is the hole, hit it, get downhill, all that good stuff.
And a stud's not going to look like a stud unless he doesn't have blocking.
100%.
I mean, the Barry Sanderses are unicorns, where it's like, okay, you don't want to block anyone. All right, I'm going to make 87 moves and still go. Right? Exactly. Those guys are unicorns. Right. And we saw that. I mean, we saw that last year with Derrick Henry. We've seen that with Derrick Henry in the NFL, Ryan. And, he'll be really good. But look what happens when they get into some of the big games and he can't run the football. It's not because of him. I mean, 62 yards on 20 carries this year against the Bengals. Does that mean Derrick Henry's only not a good player? Or was it just that they got dominated up front and there weren't any holes to run through? Same thing happened to him in the playoffs the year before. Right. And so the running back needs a great offensive line unless you're Barry Sanders. I mean, Barry Sanders and Walter Payton are probably the only two backs I saw in my life that could still have success in spite of the offensive line. It's just that's why they're the two greatest running backs I've ever seen. And with all due respect to Jim Brown, I never saw Jim Brown play, so he doesn't count for me. I never saw Gale Sayers play. I'm just talking about the guys that I've seen play in my lifetime. Mm-hmm. And so, to your point, Ryan, you don't need elite backs if the line is there. But at the end, also, they've got plenty of talent running back. Yes. To your point, if the offensive line plays better, they'll run the football. There's no doubt in my mind.
And despite the yards per carry and the rushing output last game not being overly impressive, I don't think anybody left that game and thought like, wow, Ultra Estimate is a problem, right? Like Chris Tyree is a problem, Logan Diggs is a problem. Like I don't think anybody left that game and said, wow, we need to get a better running back in here. Like I don't think that that's what happens in that battle. But what I do know is that for a passing game to be better, Brian, you need the trigger man to be better. You need wide receivers to be better and more confident, or pass catchers, I should just say in general, and you need the offensive line to also block better. So that's a lot of moving parts.
And you need timing,
to get a passing game
which is why it takes more time. I've said this before. Yes. That's why the pass game and why the offense take more time to get going than a defense does. It's the main reason I've always said the defense should be ahead of the offense in the beginning of fall camp. Because those things do take more time. It takes more cohesion. It takes more time. You got to be on the same page. I got to know what you're thinking, because sometimes I just got to throw the ball out to a spot and you're going to go run underneath it. And I just got to trust you. Do you think that Tyler Buckner is there with his receivers from his own experience? No, he's not there yet. But his receivers also have to do a better job of getting open and saying, hey, I'm going to trust that you will get there. Yep. And make those plays, because he did that once to Lorenzo Styles, and I don't think Lorenzo finished the route off the way he needed to. Now, am I blaming Lorenzo for that incompletion? No. Tyler's got to put it on him a little bit more, but I don't think Lorenzo helped it. Maybe he's close enough to maybe lay out if he finishes the route off better, and that's something he's got to work on, because we saw that against Oklahoma State last year too. He kind of slowed up a little bit on a deep route. He's got to learn to track the ball a little bit better down the field. So those are all parts of it that we need to see improve for Notre Dame. So, Ryan, let's move over to the defense now. Let's dive into the Notre Dame defense against the Marshall offense. We'll start off with the scoring units. Notre Dame's defense last year was very good. For the most part, they had a couple bad games that people like to use as holdups to why the defense wasn't good. Those are just the anomalies. The Notre Dame defense was actually quite good for most of the year last year. They played poorly against Florida State. They played poorly against Oklahoma State. They had and I would say they played poorly against North Carolina. Those are the three games I said they played poorly. I don't think they played poorly against Toledo. I mean, Toledo had a pick six in that game. And also, Toledo had just two big plays. They had a 67-yard pass and a 66-yard run. They really only had two plays. Dominated Wisconsin, completely shut down David Bell and Purdue. Held David Bell to minus 10 yards a catch, well over 100 yards for a dude that was going for like 120 a pop in just about every other game. Obviously, you did a good job keeping USC in check. You dominated Stanford. You dominated Georgia Tech. You dominated Navy. I mean, just on and on and on and on. For the most part last year, they were a very good defense. The thing that we saw on Saturday is this version of the defense, at least for one game, was also very good at limiting the big plays that plagued them so much of last year. You had the one mistake on the zone blitz, the double safety blitz. But outside of that, I thought they did a pretty good job of limiting the big plays. Now, let's see them be able to kind of go out and now finish more drives off. That's something I want to see. Didn't force any turnovers last week. I want to see more turnovers. I want to see the ball on the ground a little bit more from the other team. And that's what makes this one really interesting, because Marshall is not great at getting into the red zone touchdown, but then this is one of the weirdest stat lines I've ever seen. You rarely see a team this much higher with their touchdown defense. So basically, they must have had like the worst. I'm going to look up their numbers. They must have had like the worst kicking situation in the history of college football. I was going to look at this earlier, and I lost track of time, and I wanted to see what their field goal situation was. They went 8 of 13 last year. On field goals. So that would explain this. But this is one of the, Ryan, I don't know if I've ever seen anything like this, which, meaning they don't score much in the red zone, but when they do, it's touchdowns. You know what I mean? It's a wild, wild stat line for me.
Wait, it's touchdown or nothing in the red zone, baby. Yeah. I mean, that's the big thing, right? I mean,
yeah.
but
I mean,
yeah.
Sorry.
No, I was just going to say, all joking aside, just kind of take this from a different angle, Brian. Just like we already mentioned a little bit, but 25 turnovers for this offense, man. We were talking about Marshall. That is gross. That's absolutely gross. Because if you look at it, I mean, otherwise it's like, okay, 33 points a game, not terrible. Yards per game's nice. Look at that, 456 yards a game. You're like, okay, cool. There's a lot of good numbers on this board, but then that one really deflates you, man. And not only deflates your offense, also we already talked about it deflates the defense a lot too, right? So that 25 forced turnovers is bad.
Now
really
they got better in the second half of the year, but they had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 8 games. They turned it over at least twice. Ugh. It was this how it went 3, 3, 3, 0, 6, 2, 2, and then they got a little bit better 0, 1, 1, 0, 2, 2. So they got a little bit better down the stretch. The big thing is they stopped throwing interceptions in the second half of the year. Was a big thing. They threw 10 interceptions in the first 6 games and only 5 in the last 7 games, which helped them. And then look, Grant Wells was a very young quarterback. I mean, he was a very inexperienced kid. Played a decent amount the year before, but he was still young. He was still inexperienced, and so he got better last year as the year went on. Put up really good numbers. I mean, because a guy that throws for 3,500 yards should throw for more than 16 touchdowns. That's like that. I'm going to show this because this is weird. So they ranked 18th in the nation in passing yards, but 77 in touchdowns. They ranked 65th last year nationally in rushing yards, but 4th in touchdowns. They had some of the weirdest stat lines I've ever seen from a team in my life. Now, so just really, and obviously I made a little bit of a mistake down here. This should be third down defense, and this is third down offense. And then obviously this part's incorrect. So forgive me. I'll get that corrected next time. But these are actually defensive stats, just statistics for Notre Dame. So, but this right here is troubling. That right there is troubling. But if you're Notre Dame, you were good at forcing turnovers last year, but now you got to prove that you can be that way this year.
100%.
Because they and there weren't really like 3 balls on the ground that they just didn't fall on. There weren't any balls on the ground. The only time I can remember them coming close to an interception was or a turnover was Ben Morrison undercutting that in cut that he almost picked off, and it wasn't really that close to picking it off, but it's the closest they came to picking it off. So I want to see them get the ball a little bit more in this game, Ryan. That's going to be a big key for me.
And another context is that we can't assume that Marshall's going to be just as bad with turning the football over as well, because they have a different trigger man, right? I mean, it's no longer Grant Wells, who's now at Virginia Tech. They have Henry Colombi, who is the transfer from Texas Tech, spent some time at Utah State before that. They also have a different running back than they had last year, right? Like right now, Rasheen Ali is not a part of the program. They have Kalen LeBourne, who's kind of their bell cow to a degree, right? So there are different players also handling the football. So I just don't want Notre Dame fans to look at this and say like, oh, they're terrible with the football. Right? Like they're a turnover heavy team. Last year, no doubt about it. You can make that assumption and you can look at that and just be like, yep, they turned the football over a ton. This year, we have to wait and see what they are in that regard, because they have different people toting the rock than they did a year ago.
Let's go to the ground attack. Now, this is interesting, Ryan, because they did lose their top runner, Rasheen Ali, but they also got Kalen LeBourne, who was at Florida State, was a former 5-star recruit. I was actually there at the opening when he committed to Florida State, and he drove up in a Lamborghini. Do you remember that at all?
I don't.
Drove up in a Lamborghini and committed to Florida State. It was kind of funny and also like, dear Lord, this is getting out of hand. All at the same time. And, talented kid, just has never been able to stay healthy, right? Well, he had 100 yards in the opener against a school from his home state of Virginia. He is a Virginia kid, obviously. But there's going to be some athletes there, Ryan, that, the kid Payne's a tough, gritty, like LeBourne is a reclamation project from a Power 5 team that you're hoping can be healthy. Ethan Payne is like the prototype what you'd expect to see a running back at a place like Marshall.
Is that number 28? Is that number 28?
Yeah. Just a tough kid that, was probably a really prolific high school back, but just, not a great athlete, not a, just that try hard kid with good vision and feet. And that's kind of how it's going to be. But
if he's the guy I'm thinking of, then he broke a long touchdown in that game against Norfolk State.
He usually won it, broke it back up the left sideline. Yes. Yeah. It's really, again, Norfolk State's not very good.
Yes.
But but the one thing they do have is they have a pretty good sized offensive line.
Yes.
And so Notre Dame's defensive line defense struggled with pass pro, and in the fourth quarter they couldn't stop the run. But they still were pretty good against the run against Ohio State for most of the game. And it's not like Ohio State didn't try to run. I've had people say, well, they didn't stop the run once Ohio State tried. You weren't watching the same game I was watching. Right. They tried to run the first half. Now, that's something that they got to do is they got to finish better. Right? You can't just say, well, we shut them down for 2.5 quarters. Well, you got to shut them down for 4 because that's what was needed. And so I think like the stat line last week for Ohio State is a little bit misleading on how well they played for a big chunk of the game. I do think they wore down a little bit. Well, now you're going against a Marshall offensive line that does have they're not super athletic, Ryan, outside of maybe Ethan Driscoll. That's just, he's a young kid, an up-and-coming kid. Yeah, it's DNA, baby. But the other kids are more just try-hard guys. They're the Kane Madden types. They did lose. They're not a lot of experience, as you pointed out in your inside look at Marshall offensive players today. Not a lot of guys with experience. Try-hard guys, but they're big and they battle. They compete. They really, you saw it against Norfolk State. You saw it last year. These kids at Marshall will compete, and they will play hard. And Notre Dame's defensive line is going to be undersized. I need to see a team that's out there. We talked in the offseason, Ryan. This defense has to be more disruptive against the run. I think that's even when they were playing well, that was the thing we still didn't see against Ohio State.
Yep.
We didn't see those penetrations that were forcing -2s and -3s. And that was the troubling thing for me on top of the finish. We need to start seeing that a little bit this week because this is not a real athletic line. And if this defensive line, which is undersized, isn't able to get penetration with somewhat consistency against this team, I'm going to be a little bit concerned about just how good this ground defense can be for Notre Dame this year. Do you agree or disagree with that sentiment?
No, I agree completely because I was going to say, Brian, like there are a couple players on this offensive line that are really good players for their level of Marshall. I've talked about Ethan Driscoll, obviously. Trent Holler, their left guard, is a former ECU transfer, so he's a decent football player. And then they have a Rutgers transfer as well that kind of mixes in on this offensive line. So it's not like it's no talent, but I agree with you. Outside of Driscoll, I think that there is not real much foot quickness on this group at all. And I think that with what you have defensively, like Jason Adamalola, the Howard Crosses of the world, like they need to have big days, man. They need to. They need to be able to split some gaps and make some plays. And that goes to Riley Mills, maybe just, slanting inside and taking a gap. Like those guys need to have those penetration plays, Brian, because to your point, you're going to be facing some units here pretty soon, like the BYUs of the world that have a very good offensive line. And if you can't create penetration, it was like before when I talked about, your ability to if you're not able to, from a offensive line perspective, to push around a Marshall defensive line, it's the same thing here. If defensive line is not able to create some penetration and make some plays, then I have trouble projecting that to happen against BYU. Right. I have trouble projecting that to happen against Andrew Voorhees. I have trouble projecting that to happen against Jordan McFadden from Clemson, right? Like you need to win those matchups because I think it's an indicator of if things are trending in the right direction,
right,
or if things are stagnant in that end.
Because you can't say like the offensive line. If you wanted to look for excuses, if you're the person who's inclined for that, you could say, and there's a level of truth to this. Look, the offensive line, you had 2 guys against Ohio State that were playing positions they hadn't played in a while. All right, Josh Lugg was a right tackle all of 2021. Zeke Correll was a guard all of 2021. Zeke's moved to center. Josh has moved to guard. You lost your All-American. You've got Andrew Kristofic stepping in, who's a good player, but not Jarrett Patterson. That unit's only been together for a couple weeks, right? And so, of course, you struggled against Ohio State. Okay, I don't buy it. I'm sorry, I don't. But like, I think there's a little bit of validity to that in regard to the belief of I don't buy it as an excuse for Ohio State, but I buy it in that if this unit continues to play together, they will get better. If that makes sense, Ryan. So like, it's like, okay, it's not good enough because this isn't moral victory time or excuse making time, but it gives me optimism that they're going to get better. You can't use that excuse on the defensive line. Howard Cross has played a ton of football. Jacob Lacey's played a ton of football. Jason Adamiola's played a ton of football. Isaiah Foskey, Riley Mills, Justin Adamiola, all those guys have played a ton of football. Chris Smith's played a ton of football. You can't use that, well, they're going to get better because as they get more experience, excuse. This is one of the most experienced units you have on your football team.
Yep.
So they got to step up real quickly. Now, again, they played good, solid football against Ohio State, but I'm expecting more from the defensive line. And they need to show that this week. The defensive line needs to come out really ticked off this week. I want to see Jason Adamiola wanting to get like 7 tackles for loss in his mind this week. Like, I am so mad that I didn't play like the star that I think I can be, right? I want to see if Isaiah Foskey with a little P&V this week. You know what I'm saying? I want to see these guys play with we didn't get it done when we think we're the best unit on the football team, and we didn't get it done this weekend, and then step up and really dominate this Marshall front. If I don't see that, Ryan, I'm going to get a little bit concerned about the front. It's going to be good, but is it going to be the great unit that we think it can be and that it should be? That is more. Because, again, what are we referring to here, guys? I keep us 8-4. If somebody said this, if they play like they did against Ohio State, it'd be 8-4. No, they won't, because they don't play Ohio State 3 more times.
Yeah,
they're still gonna beat 9 of the 10 teams left on the schedule at least, right? But that's not the standard. That's not the standard we're talking about here. The standard is you should be playing like one of the best defensive lines, not just a good top 25 defensive line. You're supposed to play like a top 10 off defensive line, and they didn't do that against Ohio State. And they need to do that against Marshall. And it carries over into the pass thing, because the one thing Marshall was good at last year was protecting the quarterback. That's where I'm curious how it translates now that they've lost so many guys. Because they lost 4 starters on the offensive line last year, right? Yep. Now they had more than 5 played. Driscoll played last year. I mean, they had more guys play, but they lost 4 guys who started a chunk of their games last year. They were
the one returning starter is the center, who I think started a little bit at guard as well. And he started like 7 or 8 games. So like even he wasn't a full game, like it wasn't a full season starter, right? So like this is a relatively new unit. I mean, the right tackle and the center are the only 2 returning starters. I talked a lot about Ethan Driscoll, but he's a first-year starter this year as a junior. Like, he's not a guy that I mean, he played in 12 games last year, but he didn't start a single football game. Right. So to your point, just kind of to reiterate it a little bit, is that, yes, this is an inexperienced unit, which if that was the number you gave up last year, that's it. I don't know. We'll see. Something's got to give.
So this matchup's intriguing too, Ryan, and the only one that to me carries over a lot is this one right here. I don't think this up here carries over a lot, because Marshall's going to be a very different looking pass attack this year. Grant Wells was an athletic kid who had a pretty good downfield arm for that level. Would you agree with that? You know, he had some arm strength, arm talent, which is why he transferred to Marshall or to Virginia Tech.
Yep.
The kid that they're replacing him with can't throw the ball very far or very hard. But what he is really accurate and smart. And so last year they were a team that was really high on yards because they could hit some big plays, and they had a quarterback that could get the ball down the field a little bit, but they were really inefficient, as you can see down here. I take away the interception part, because I do think Henry Colombi turns the ball over a lot because he doesn't have a great arm. I expect this to be a much more efficient Marshall offense. We saw a little bit of that against Norfolk State. Now, look, I know it's Norfolk State, but Ryan, I don't care who you're playing. When you go 24 of 26 as an offense throwing the football, that's really efficient. And I don't care who you're playing. I mean, look, Bryce Young from Alabama, the Heisman Trophy winner, was playing against Utah State last week, who barely beat UConn, and he completed 64% of his passes, right? I mean, he had a pretty good game. Let's look at Miami, right? Miami played Bethune-Cookman. They've got Tyler Van Dyke. He's supposed to be a big-time player. He completed 81.3% of his passes against them. Their backup quarterback, Jake Garcia, came in and completed all 8 of his passes. And as a team, they went 21 of 24 for 87.5%. Marshall beat that by 5 percentage points against Norfolk State. Again, similar, Bethune-Cookman, Norfolk State, similar level of competition. So I'm trying to put into context, completing over 90% of your passes, I don't care who you're playing against, is really good. Now, a lot of it was really short, quick stuff. Yes. And it looked a lot different than what they were last year. And so it's just hard to look at the numbers, if we're being honest, and say they're translatable. So that's why I don't want to spend a lot of time on this part of the matchup. We'll talk more about it tomorrow in the keys to victory, because the pass defense is going to be important. But the one that I do think translates, Ryan, that is going to be intriguing to watch is the sacks and sacks allowed thing. Notre Dame's defensive line needs to come out a little bit ticked off on Saturday, to be honest with you, and just overwhelm Marshall. It needs to happen. That's the part from this that I'm gonna be really interested to see.
I think that's an overall theme, right? Because we talked about that as far as getting tackle for loss numbers against this team as well. I think that the sacks is another big one, Brian, because we illustrated the offensive line is relatively inexperienced. Only 2 starters coming back, talented at some points, but they're still very inexperienced. And I like the offensive line versus defensive line comparison that you made from the previous game, because the offensive line was underwhelming and it was disappointing, but also we knew that there was growth that had to happen from last season, right? Defensive line wise, most of the offseason I was just kind of like, yep, it's going to be a good unit, like it's going to be a really good defensive line, probably a top 5 to 10 national type of defensive line. And we didn't quite get that obviously against Ohio State. So this is a big opportunity. I think, I want to see tackle for loss numbers. I want to see sack numbers. I want to see just pressure numbers, man. Like I need to see Isaiah
Super
Foskey
disruptive
and Jason
game.
Adamalola come alive in this game.
Super disruptive game. Tackles for loss, sacks, turnovers, pass breakups. I want to see the ball on the ground a lot in this game.
And I also want to see Riley Mills, because Riley Mills, I thought, had some really nice flashes against Ohio State. I thought he had some good pressures at points. I thought
he was really the only guy of the starters that had any consistency getting after the quarterback in that game.
Yeah, I was going to say that he was the most disruptive defensive line that Notre Dame had during that game, in my opinion, right? So I want to see him go from that, though, to a star in this game, right? Like I want to see that transition to the next step, because he's a good player. He obviously had a good football game against Ohio State, at least the most comparative to everyone else on the defensive line. But even you want him to keep progressing, right? Like this is a game of progression for me. Progressing from underwhelming in the first game to good, from good to great. Everyone has to get better, obviously, in this type of game. And I think that starts with the defensive line, to your point.
So, Ryan, that is the statistical matchup between Notre Dame stacking up tomorrow. While Vince will be back tonight, I may join him tonight for a little mailbag and a little impromptu. They're going to do the Wednesday mailbag. I'm going to probably be Vince's guest tonight for the mailbag. He's working on trying to find somebody else, but if he doesn't, it'll be me, and most likely it will be me. So we'll be there tonight at 6 o'clock for the IB Nation Sports Talk Show. And we are going to have a mailbag here. So if you have some questions, we have about 10 of them starred so far. So if you have some questions or comments, you can ask us in there as well. But this is the statistical analysis of the game and breakdown of the game, which can be a little challenging this early in the year, Ryan. It really can. But I think it gives you some things to at least look at these two teams and evaluate in that regard. And of course, we'll be back tomorrow with keys to the game, set Friday. We will have Ryan's going to be sort of doing a road show on Friday. So he's going to be coming to us from his hotel in Chicago, because he is going to be flying into Chicago this weekend, getting ready for the game. He will be at the game on Saturday. We still plan on tailgating. We're going to be in the stadium lot right in front of the stadium. So I ponied up for some really good spots, everybody. So you'll be able to come over and see us over there. I'll let you know specifically where we're going to be when we get there. So we'll let you know on that one. And of course, tomorrow or Friday, we'll do our game predictions on Friday of Notre Dame and Marshall. So we'll kind of talk about how the game is going to go. But we also, Vince, was opening up an email from Vince. Also, Ryan, because I just got Vince's predictions. We're going to be doing a preview and predictions for Alabama, Texas, Tennessee, Pittsburgh, Kentucky, Florida, and BYU, Baylor. And then, of course, we're going to all pick our upset pick. I got the Notre Dame game wrong last week, but I did get the other 3. Ryan, I think you went 2-2 last week. Sean and Vince got the Notre Dame game correct. They both picked Ohio State, but they then got the BYU or the Utah, Florida game wrong. So we all did okay last week for our predictions. And then we also got to pick an upset pick. And so that's something we're going to do. That's going to be something we only do on the message board, though. We'll pick our our weekly upset picks, which is an unranked team beating a ranked team, or a team that's at least a 6-point underdog or more that we think is going to win. I picked Arizona to beat San Diego State last week straight up. Not even just cover the spread, but straight up. I think there were 6.5-point underdog. And if not for players, just insanity of, because you picked Purdue. Yes. If just not for just terrible play calling down the stretch, by them, you would have got that right. I think Vince picked West Virginia to beat Pitt, if not for just receivers who cannot catch at all. Then he'd have got that one right. But that's what makes college football so good. That's what makes
Pittsburgh was
college
always
football so
going to
good.
win, baby.
Get the
Pittsburgh
heck
was
out of
always
here
going to
with your-
win.
Get the heck out of here with your nonsense. Get the heck out of here with your nonsense. You and your Keaton Slovis love.
Did you see my upset pick of the week though? I think it was.
I haven't looked at yours yet. No, what was yours?
Oh, for this week?
Yeah,
we'll put it out there already.
We'll go ahead and we'll have some fun with it.
Vanderbilt over Wake Forest.
Ooh, okay.
A little spicy, man. A little spicy.
Okay, now is Sam Hartman going to play this week? I know he's back on the team, but is he going to play this week?
I'm not sure about that, but I'm riding the hot hand and Mike Wright this week for Vanderbilt.
There you go. Interesting one. So that's going to do it for this part of the show. Don't go, though, because we are going to have a mailbag. But if you are going to take off or whenever you take off, or you know what, just do it now. Hit that like button, everybody. Make sure you're subscribed to the channel. Hit the notification bell and share this podcast. We would appreciate that very, very much. On, if you're listening via podcast, give us a 5-star review. We would appreciate that as part of the Irish Breakdown podcast. So, Ryan, let's go to the mailbag. And if you guys have some questions that you want us to answer, I can tell you one. Archer said once, Brian, I want your Arkansas State versus Ohio State analysis. In the words of Clubber Lang, pain. That's what we're going to see this weekend for the poor. What are they? What's their
Red
name?
Wolves?
Red Wolves. I knew it was some kind of wolf. I just couldn't remember what it was.
Do you know who their quarterback is?
I do not.
Blackman that used to play for Florida State.
Oh wow, he's still in college.
He's still there.
Dear Lord. Didn't he get beat out last year at one point in time for them?
Either got beat out or he got hurt.
I remember last year he started at quarterback and somebody beat him out last year. So Lane Hatcher, I thought, is the guy that beat him out.
I think he transferred. So they got James Blackman now.
So that's not good. That's not good. Yeah, he is at Texas State, Ryan. Lane Hatcher's at Texas State. He did okay in this first game. Old James. He did. He went 15-20 for 210 yards and 2 touchdowns, no picks against Grambling. So man,
it's a good start. It's progress.
What's that guy's name? Hugh Jackson. Hugh Jackson. The fighting Hugh Jacksons. Yeah. Yep. So there you go. So we will not be doing an Ohio State Arkansas State preview this week, man.
That was actually my upset pick of the week. So
yeah, wouldn't that suck? That sucks so bad. That would just oh my gosh, that would suck so bad. I would just quit. I would quit. Let's get going. Domer Grizz. Among the surprise players who didn't play on Saturday was Prince Colley. Prince Colley played. He just didn't play on defense. He did play on special teams. But do you expect him to play this weekend, especially since Maris was inconsistent last week? And how can he improve? No. Again, I want to warn everybody. Stop overreacting to one game. Maris Liufau hadn't played a game of football since December of 2020. Yeah. He did some nice things Saturday. He did some things that he's got to get better at. There's no doubt. But you're not going to overact as, screw it, put him on the bench, right? Prince didn't play for a reason, right? He's not a guy. Ryan asked me this before the show. He said, in all your intel stuff, when you talk to sources, was there ever a time when Prince's name came up and it was not since fall camp started? He got some stuff during the summer about how hard he worked and all that, but not as far as playing linebacker. So they need to get Maris going. That's the key. It's not about just replacing a bunch of dudes who didn't play well against Ohio State. It's about who you think your best players are, getting them rolling, getting them going. And there's no doubt that Maris is one of their best players. Now, if Prince is going to play this weekend, I hope he does. I hope all the linebackers play because that means Notre Dame dominates. And I hope that Prince gets in there and gets some opportunity to play because I think that's the thing for Prince Colley, Ryan, is this is a kid that's still learning the linebacker position. He didn't really play linebacker in high school. He was a running back, receiver, rover, safety, edge rusher. He did a little bit of everything, and he's still learning the position. He's got a lot of Jeremiah Owusu-Koramoah in him in that regard because he is learning. Jeremiah would never play that position either, and he didn't get on the field until his third year. Now, he would have played special teams in his second year if he didn't get hurt, but he was not battling for time as a rover in 2019. He wasn't. It wasn't until 2020 he really emerged into that role. And I think Prince is going to need some time. We have to be patient with him for those reasons. But if he can push himself, then maybe he could earn some time. But I would rather see him at Mike than Will taking snaps away from Maris because that's just, I think, a position maybe he's more comfortable in. I also want to see JT Tuihalamaka this week as well. That's a guy that I want to see playing more because the play at Mike linebacker's got to be better. And so I'm going to want to see some of those guys play a little bit. Again, I'm not overreacting and say, hey, don't play that guy. JD can't play. Well, JD's had some good moments, but he's got to play better. But I'm going to have a little less patience for the guys that played a bunch of football last year. When they're still kind of showing some of the same things that we saw last year. But he is playing a different position than he did last year, so give him a little bit of time as well. Mm-hmm. Full house backfield with a super chat. I like what you did there. 1842. That's good. That's good. I dig that. I get offensive coordinators and defensive coordinators have different skills and scheme and play calling, but do they both generally know offense and defense and how to attack, react? Meaning, can Golden and Marcus Freeman help Reese, or does Reese know defensive principles? Tommy Reese did not get to this point by not knowing defenses. I mean, again, he did not have a great game against Ohio State. It doesn't dismiss the big games that they had last year. It doesn't dismiss how they shredded Oklahoma State last year, right? Let's not overreact to one game. And I think it's the influence of Marcus Freeman that is part of the reason the offense didn't look good last week. And that's not my opinion. That's coming from Marcus Freeman's mouth. And he's been saying it all offseason. I mean, it's kind of like he's been telling us this was going to be the case. So, like, if Marcus Freeman would come out after the game and said, "Hey, look, this is the game plan I wanted," I'd have been like, maybe he's just covering for his coaches. But he's been saying this since the summer. Mm-hmm. He's been saying since the summer that this is how they're going to play against Ohio State, and they did. And Ohio State was prepared for it. So maybe they shouldn't have said it as much as they did during the offseason. But that's a different conversation for a different day. But look, coordinators always help each other if it's a good staff. There's always conversation like, hey, I'm wanting to run this concept. What would be a way I could do it that could give you problems? Mm-hmm. And you do that with your offensive line coach. Hey, Harry, we're trying to come up with a pressure against this mic protection, and what are some things that you could do? This is the way that they do it that could give you problems. Oh, this is what we really don't want to see. I coached on the team once, Ryan. First of all, there's a funny comment. Somebody said that, Marcus Freeman, my concern with Marcus Freeman is something about rudimentary knowledge of offenses. And I'm like, you cannot be a successful defensive coordinator if you have a rudimentary understanding of offense. You can't be a good offensive coordinator if you have a rudimentary understanding of defenses. Like, what I studied more in the offseason than I didn't study other offenses. I studied defenses. Yeah. What are teams doing defensively that I have to have an answer for? Yep. And same thing with defensive. Now, you'll go to clinics and talk to other teams, offensive coaches. Hey, man, what are you guys doing against this three? Like, there was a time early in my coach career where like the 3-3 stack was becoming a thing. Not like we see it now, but like it was like a bigger, like it was just weird. And so, you'd talk to other offensive, are you guys seeing this? What'd you guys do to shred it? Well, this is what we did, but it's kind of that way, but you're still talking about defenses. You're not talking about, hey, how do you guys run smash? Well, okay, I can tell you how we run smash, but it's always going to be relative to the defenses you play on your schedule. And this is what I've always said when you'd see these offensive coaches going to clinics, and they'd always go to where the other offensive coaches were talking. And what scheme are you guys? What's your guys' top 3 pass schemes? I'm like, well, okay, he's going to tell you that, but what does that mean for you? How does that translate to what your personnel is? Do you have a quarterback that can execute those things? Are the defenses you're facing conducive to that? So there's all types of, so like I've told a story about how when I was at Duquesne, where we hit a big play against cover 2 on double posts. Well, in theory, you're not supposed to have success against that. So if we're playing a bunch of teams that play cover 2 and they play cover 2 correctly, the reason we beat Robert Morris with the double post is because they didn't play cover 2 correctly, because their boundary safety or their field safety would flat foot. You can't flat foot as a cover 2 guy because he wanted to come downhill and hit. He was a pit transfer that just always wanted to come downhill and make a play. Not the kind of guy you want playing cover 2. You know what I mean? If you play cover 2 correctly, you're taking away double post. So that can't be your bread and butter if your schedule's filled with a bunch of teams playing cover 2. And that's my point. So I could explain to you how great we were at double posts because we played a lot of cover 3 and cover 4 teams. Well, if you're playing a schedule with a bunch of cover 2 teams, then I can break it down to you, but you're wasting your time because you're just not going to be able to run it as effectively as we did. And so that's the thing is like you're actually studying the other side of the ball. And so just that's kind of how it is now. That's where coordinators help each other, Ryan, is, I've talked to my buddy of mine, Justin Lustig, who's now coaches at Vanderbilt. But he's the guy that I'd spend most of my time talking with when we were coaching together at Christopher Newport. It was not the other offensive coaches. It was Justin. Like, hey man, we're playing press man. Here's how I'm going to teach this, the slant technique. What do you think? Well, here's how I would counter it. Okay, well then, okay, here's what I want to do, and here's how I would counter it. Or he'd say, hey, Drisk, we're going to come up and we're going to play more man this week. Here's what this other team is doing. What are some things you think we can do to kind of help against it? And those are the things that you do. So there should be a lot of interaction between offensive and defensive coaches. And Marcus Freeman had talked a lot about that when he was defensive coordinator. He talked a lot about that last year, how much him and Tommy communicated with different things. And so, yes, I do think they help each other, but not in the way that I think the question is phrased. It's not to help Tommy Reese have a better understanding of defensive principles. It's about what are some things that could give us, if we're doing this, problems. And what I was going to say is when I was at Muhlenberg, our defensive coordinator, our head coach was Mike Donnelly, he was a longtime defensive coordinator, come from Columbia. Our entire playbook was literally created by him. And the playbook was built around all the stuff that he had a hard time stopping when he was a defensive coordinator. That was our playbook. And it's a part of the reason he won, because he's like, well, look, if I can't stop it, then nobody else is going to be able to stop it, and he was right. And that's why he was able to build Muhlenberg into such an excellent program for such a long period of time. And so, yes, those are things that you can always do, right? Do you want to take a crack at that as well?
I think that you hit it on the head. It's the intricacies of playing defensive football. It's not as much the schematics of playing it. Like Tommy Reese, for instance, because you used him as an example, he's going to understand 4-2-5. This is what just a general what a Rover's responsibilities are in this defense. But to your point, right? It's what if I'm going to throw this at them, how are they going to counter it? Because football is it's a chess match. That I think that you've said that before, Brian. That was one of the things you miss about it, right? Is the fact of like
the mental chess match. Right.
What's the next step, right? Like
you think you're taking away my best play with this coverage, but in reality, I got something. Exactly.
And how do you get there? It's a psychological game, right? It's understanding what they're thinking, what they might do, what their counter could be. It's almost like a guessing game to a degree, but if you do it well, it doesn't become a guessing game. It becomes just kind of you're being proactive with your approach, right? So I agree. I think that was also my favorite part of coaching too, was especially when you're calling a defense, is trying to guess, what play is coming based upon what the down and distance is and what the situation is and what formation they line up into. And, is there motion? Are they trading? Whatever it would be, those things bring a situational understanding of why an offense will want to do that. So why do they want to do that? Right. It's like the general thing of like, I come from an education background. I always wanted students not to ask, I didn't want them to ask how to do something. I want them to ask why they're doing something, right? And why am I doing this? Why is this helping me? Why is this helping my process? And in order to do that, I think you need to understand both sides of it, right? Football is an offensive versus defensive game. If I don't understand what an offense is trying to do to me, how can I understand how I'm going to counter potentially the next move, right? So that's kind of the big process for me.
I want to address something here real quick, Ryan, that was asked, and there were some people that answered the specific person, but just in case there are others who maybe aren't in the chat or have a question, and it says, Mr. Shaughnessy said, fellas, is the game only available on Peacock? No, it is available. All Notre Dame home games are available on Peacock. The only game that is only available on Peacock is the UNLV game. So that'll be the only game that's only available on Peacock. So I just wanted to make sure that people understood that. Make sure we got that question asked. John A1 with a question. He says, I want to see if Marcus Freeman can adjust as a head coach, see his overall philosophy match what he had as a defensive coordinator, which was I'm not going to ask players to do things they're going to have a hard time being successful, but allow the offense to call a game where they can actually be their best. I need to see a much better identity of this football team established. Ryan, that's not even a question. Completely. That's a comment, and I think he nailed it. He nailed it.
John, that's my biggest thing too in this game is I want to see identity, right? Because I think what we left the Ohio State game not really understanding exactly what this team wants to be, especially on the offensive side of the football. Like I'm not sure what they want to be as an offensive football team. So I want to see if there's more trust in playmakers, if offensive linemen play better, all that nuance to kind of the offensive side of the football and the defensive side of the football. Like we already talked about the defensive line, I thought played okay in spurts, but like I didn't think they played overall well, if I would kind of quantify it like that, right? So I think it's a big game to kind of this is almost like your test game as far as like this is what our identity is going to be. So like, we want to kind of make sure that it kind of fits and it assimilates a little bit. Right. So I agree completely. Like, this is a big identity understanding type of game for Notre Dame, in my opinion.
Yep. Good stuff, John. Johnny Wentz says also Tyree needs to play running back. The slot play was a decent wrinkle, but it needs to be just that, a wrinkle. Allow the wide receivers an opportunity to be effective. I agree with that wholeheartedly.
100%.
And he says it again, Chris Tyree seems to consistently be the back with the highest yards per carry average in Notre Dame. Why isn't he used as more of a running threat? It feels the staff is determined to use him as a hybrid running back slot guy. I agree. And I don't think that's the way to go. I don't think that's properly using Chris Tyree. There's times for that, right? I mean, I'm okay with that at times. Yeah. But it only works if you're going to do other things out of it.
Yes.
That's my point.
Did Brian, I don't know if this is like I don't know if this is just a unique opinion for me or not, but Chris Tyree might have been the one guy on both sides of the ball that I thought was the oddest usage during that game. I don't know if that's just me or not, but like,
he's one of for sure.
I left that game and I'm just like, I don't understand what they were trying to do with Chris. Like, I did functionally understand it. Like, I understand that you're trying to hit the edge and all that stuff. Like, I get that, but I don't understand why that was the role that they chose to use.
Or the only role, really.
Well, yeah. I mean,
because his only other carries were on. Yeah, the only other carries were late in the game on inside zones with like less than a minute left in the half.
Yeah,
right. You're not really using them there.
I mean,
and why not use it off the power read stuff, Ryan? Like, why not use that 100%. Jet motion off the power read where you get Aldrich Estime out as sort of a lead blocker for Tyree, and you're running the power read there, where you're at least doing something to make those inside backers think about, okay, I can't just take off for Chris Tyree because then Tyler Buckner's going to pull this thing and hurt us, right? Those are the things I didn't quite understand. It was just okay, jet sweep. All right, here it comes.
And
against the team with speed.
I'm sure it wasn't a give every time that Chris Tyree was on a jet.
It wasn't.
It really felt like it. Yeah. It felt like it though in real time. And I'm just kind of like, you really pigeonholed this guy into just being a jet sweep guy. Like, that's what you made him in that game. You know, like made him very niche-y in that game. And I just think that Chris Tyree can be more than that, because even if that was just his role as a runner, you need to get him involved in the passing game in some other, unique ways and creative ways. And I just felt like there was not a great creativity to how to use Chris Tyree in that first game.
Agree. Leighton Burkholder says, if Tommy Rees does not go back to his normal, more aggressive play calling this weekend, how high is your concern level? And then where is your confidence for the rest of the season? If he doesn't adjust back to what he is, I'll be very concerned about the season. Very concerned. But I honestly have no concern about that. I don't. Because again, I don't think it's about Tommy Rees. I just don't. We'll see. I could be wrong on that. I'm not taking blame away from Tommy on Saturday. I'm just saying I think that was a staff decision where this is what they felt they needed to do to protect their defense. Hopefully they never make that mistake again and say, look, best way for your offense to protect your defense is to score and score and score and score. That's how you protect your defense. Right.
Leighton, I'd even take it up a notch too, Brian. I would say this: if Notre Dame comes out against Marshall and just has a very inept game across the board, like the offensive line doesn't play better, if your wide receivers aren't being better, working off a press and creating separation, if the defensive line doesn't have a much better game, if the linebackers don't, play more gap sound and make plays, then it's a concern across the board. Like, it's not just a concern just for Tommy Rees. Like, that's a concern in general, because again, there are some positives to take from the Ohio State game. There are
a lot, actually.
A lot. 100%. So in this game, I think that this is going to be pretty telling of what type of team this is. Not even from a point blank on field perspective, from a mentality perspective, from a growth perspective. Like, there's so many layers from this game. I think you can kind of leave and be like, okay, they'll be all right. They're going to be okay here.
Yep. Agree. And we had a follow-up from 99 Problems, but became one. Brian, if it isn't about Tommy Rees, then why wouldn't you have more concern? I would have more thinking it came from above him. It's because I keep saying this. I think this was specific to Ohio State. I think this is what they felt they needed to do to keep Ohio State's points down and get Ohio State out of rhythm. And it worked for the defense. That's the thing, is like the game plan, the Notre Dame offensive game plan worked perfectly for the Notre Dame defense. because they were able to keep the points down. And even on some of Notre Dame's shorter drives, Ryan, they were able to take time off the clock because they huddled and did all that stuff, right? And so it did work for the defense. It just didn't work for the team, which is why you caught an L. You know, I mean, the defense, hey, your goal is to keep Ohio State's points down. They held them to 21 points. Even with a missed field goal, if they make the field goal, it's 24 points. That's a huge success for Ohio State. I mean, that's the number of points Bama gave up against them. Actually, they gave up 24, right? So if they made the field goal, that 24 would have been the same number of points they scored against Bama in the college football national championship in 2020, right? So, I mean, the two games that they lost last year, they scored 27 and 28 points. You held them below that number. So success for the defense, but you don't win. Like the final of that game, your record isn't 1-1, right? We won on offense, we won on defense, but we lost on offense. No, you get one W or L for your team.
Lost.
And your team got an L because your game plan may have worked for your defense, but it didn't work for your offense. And so, but my whole thing is, I believe it was relative to that specific game. I don't think this is Marcus Freeman dictating to Tommy Rees, this is how we're going to call games and this is how we're going to go every single week. I don't. I think it was to this game, and I didn't like it, and I fully expect it to change. But what I'm saying is I'm not concerned about it because I don't think this was the long-term thing. However, if we do see that, though, over the next couple of weeks, then I will be very concerned. There's no doubt. There's no doubt I'll be concerned because that's going to make me think like, this is not good. This is a great recruiter and head coach who's a great defensive coordinator that doesn't understand the modern game. You got to score. I think it was relative to this game, right? And that's why I'm not trying to make any big picture assumptions because it was one game. Let's see how they move forward from it. Because the year Ohio State won a national championship, you would not have thought in week 2 that they were a team that was going to win a championship. They got beat by 2 touchdowns at home by Virginia Tech. Teams evolve. Let's give this team a chance to evolve and then make conclusions about what those things are, right? And that's all I'm asking for, is not to excuse what we saw last week. I'm not. I think we've made that very clear we're not. It's just that doesn't equal this is what the 2022 football team is going to look like. Right. That's all I'm saying. You know, I mean, Ryan, we've seen it time and time again. I mean, when Clemson won a championship in 2016, their first championship, they lost at home to Pitt in November. I mean, teams have bad games. You know, I mean, that's the reality of it. We talked about Ohio State back in 2014 and 2011. Alabama lost at home to LSU 9-6. Right? I mean, teams have bad games. They went on to win a national championship that year. You know, the year that Notre Dame Notre Dame lost to Alabama the championship, Alabama lost that year at home to Texas A&M and Johnny Manziel. Right? I mean, that's life, guys. I mean, that's life. 2015 Alabama won a championship, beat Clemson, lost at home to Ole Miss that year.
Was that Bo Wallace?
Yeah,
that was Bo Wallace
team. Yeah, gave up that Alabama team that year only gave up 15 points a game, but they gave up 43 to Ole Miss. Now again, there's some fluky plays. You remember the one that bounced off the kid, and then the other kid caught it, and all that. But you still get. I mean, teams have bad games. But you only know that was a bad game in context. I remember people panicking a little bit about that Alabama team in 2015 when they lost to Ole Miss, because if you remember, they started the year. Wisconsin gave them a game in the opener. Now, it ended up being like 34-17 or something, but Wisconsin played Alabama tough that game, which you would expect from a Wisconsin team at the time. And then they got beat by Ole Miss. You're like, this isn't a vintage Alabama team. That's what you thought in September. But what they look like in November, Ryan, that's the key, right? I mean, they got it done late in the year and went and won a championship. So it's about who you are over the course of a season, not who you are after game one. And you can only know that by playing more games. Like because after one game last year, we're thinking this Notre Dame offense is going to be legit. Like this Notre Dame offense is going to be fun this year. This offense is going to be legit because, man, did you see how they were throwing the ball all over the field and they looked great and they did this. And, you know, Jack Cohn threw for 300 some yards and, man, this team is going to be really legit. Hey, I know they didn't run the ball that well, but, man, they threw for a bunch of yards and look at the weapons in the pass game and blah, 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 blah. And then what happened? That offense disappeared over the next month, right? So you don't really know. You don't really know. And that team that you thought you looked great against that opening week, man, Florida State is back. They lost to Jacksonville State the next week, right? So one game is one game. We got to see it. We got to see how it evolves over the course of the year before we can really say definitively this is who they are. And no matter what I feel about Tommy Rees as a person or any feelings I have about Marcus Freeman as a person, and I've made him very known, I'm a big fan of Marcus Freeman as a person. I think he's going to win at Notre Dame. But the reality is if he makes decisions that don't work, that's our job, is to point them out. And we will. It's just we pointed them out in the game one, but I think people are trying to translate that into everything else. Every single coach, including Nick Saban, goes into a game with a game plan they think is going to work, and it doesn't work. It happens to everybody. It's happened to Dabo. It's happened to Saban. It happened to Urban. And Urban got caught a 31-0 L in the college football playoff to Clemson one year. You know what I'm saying? It happens. What do you do from it? That's what, and that goes back to the original thing, Ryan, is we're going to learn about this football team this week and how they respond to it. And that's coaches and players alike.
100%.
There's no doubt about it. All right, next one. Good questions today, everybody, and I'm enjoying this discussion. Blaine Tiller said, I have a hard time deciding a worse game day coach between Franklin, Harbaugh, and Kelly. Look, I am a big Brian Kelly critic, but Brian Kelly does not deserve to be in the same conversation as James Franklin as a bad game day coach.
Neither does Harbaugh.
Jim Harbaugh.
I'm about to say, neither does
Jim
Harbaugh. It's James Franklin.
How would you rank those three? I would actually put Harbaugh ahead of Kelly. I think Jim Harbaugh is a pretty decent game day coach.
Honestly, like I would have said that I probably would have went with Harbaugh first, but like if someone said Kelly over Harbaugh, I'd be like, okay, fine. I'm not going to argue it. Like it's like a 1A, 1B type of thing for me. You know?
I can't get past with Kelly. I can't get past like Tulsa 2010, Northwestern 2010, his weird 2-point conversion philosophy. You know, like there's just enough of that for I'm going to rank him behind Harbaugh. But Harbaugh's also done some weird stuff. Where you're like, oh, okay, I get it. You know,
he has done some weird stuff. I think Harbaugh's shortcomings are more from his just antics and
the
just
preparation.
The preparation portion of everything. Because I actually don't think he's a bad game day coach for the most part. Like I think he's good for the most part. He
hasn't been as good at Michigan in recent years as he was at Stanford. I will say that.
Sure.
I will say that.
But yeah, I mean, this is no conversation for me though, Brian. Like James Franklin is like, it's a 1A, 1B for me. I'll put Harbaugh at top, whatever. And then it is James Franklin. Like James Franklin's bad, man. It's not good. It's not good. Yeah. Great recruiter, great person, it seems, but like game day coach, nah.
He seems like a great person.
He portrays himself as a great person, I should say, or a nice person, I should say. Yeah.
Yes.
But game day coach, no.
Yeah.
Nah.
Ain't having it. That's how a team with all that talent goes 11-11 over the course of 2 years.
Yes.
Coach Koch says, hey, Coach, how would you feel about doing a segment that covers players' post-Notre Dame careers? I would love to talk about how they are playing in the NFL, USFL, et cetera. That's just never going to be something I'm going to do, to be honest with you. It's a message board conversation. To be honest with you, for me, Ryan, it's just there's two reasons why, right? Number one is personal. I just don't follow the NFL. And so I just can't really talk about what guys are doing. I'll pay attention to Notre Dame guys, but it's not like I'm watching every game Zach Martin plays or Quentin Nelson plays, you know?
Right.
And then the other part is we've tried that stuff in the past, you know, like Irish in the pros, stuff like that. And it just, nobody reads it. You know, we did NFL draft stuff of Notre Dame players. Nobody watched it. I mean, they were just our lowest performing things are always trying to look at Notre Dame players in the pros. It's strange. I can't explain it. But it's just how it is. You know, it's like once kids stop playing for your team, they stop paying attention. I don't know why that is. I don't know if other teams are like that too. I just know with Notre Dame fans, it's been like that when I was at BGI. I mean, you know, it's been that way for a long time. I don't know why, but Coach Koch, you're in the minority of people that want to talk about that, unfortunately. And I don't know, maybe it's because they haven't had a lot of great NFL players. But even then, it's like I hardly ever hear Notre Dame fans talking about Harrison Smith. I hardly ever hear Notre Dame fans talking about Zach Martin, you know, unless it's a relevant topic. So unfortunately, it's just not something people are all that interested in. Because if people were interested in it, I'd have Ryan do it, you know, because he does watch NFL. But it's just not. There's just other things I want him spending his time on because nobody's going to read it, and it doesn't. I mean, at the end of the day, I'm a business owner, and we got to do things that we do enough stuff that we know aren't going to make a ton of money because we like to do it. That's just one that I'm not going to. I'm not going to go there on. At least not right now. John A1 says, what is going on in the middle of the offensive line? Was it just Ohio State was the much better up the middle, or was it a lot of fixable mistakes? I think it's a lot of fixable mistakes, Ryan. And
Yeah.
Ohio State played well. Notre Dame's offensive linemen made them look better than even better than they were with how they played. Not moving their feet, that's fixable. Yeah. Not using your hands correctly, that's fixable. Doing a better job of getting off, seeing things on the second level, linebacker fires and stunts and stuff like that. It's all fixable. But just because something is fixable doesn't mean it's going to get fixed. We need to see it get fixed. I think getting Jarrett Patterson back at some point will help. But even if he doesn't come back, that group, there's too much talent in that group for them to play as bad as they did on Saturday night, in my opinion.
There was one play in particular that I saw not only during the game, but on film afterwards. And also someone posted on Twitter of, I forget number 51's name, the defensive tackle from Ohio State that had a couple nice plays. I forget his name, but there was one play where Zeke Corral was running inside. It was an inside zone play. Zeke Corral attacked his upfield shoulder, and it's just simply that 51 attacked Zeke Corral's inside shoulder. So the weak side shoulder of Zeke Corral. And I just felt like, honestly, it was just a bad angle and it was bad hand placement. And that's why he lost a rep. And his feet also got stopped on contact a little bit, right? So all three of those things, John, are fixable, right? Like you work on angles every day. That's fixable. Hand placement is very fixable. And then the last one, of course, is that you need to run your feet on contact. What does Harry Heastand do the most in practice, Brian? Finish through the play, finish through contact, finish, right? All those three things were evident on Zeke Corral. I don't think Zeke Corral, to your point, I don't think he lost reps during that game per se because he's not strong enough or he's not athletic enough. I think was some plays where hand placement was an issue, angles were an issue, or finishing were issues.
Stopped using their look. Here's the thing: if you're going against a good player that's similar to you in size, and you stop your feet and he doesn't, you're going to lose.
Yes,
that's just going to happen. That's just physics. I mean, if you stop your feet and he's still driving his feet, you're going to lose unless you're Quentin Nelson. I mean, that's the reality of it. I mean, so it's a fixable thing and it needs to get fixed because that was really frustrating for me. Yep. All right, we got some more here. Jason Rose says, hey, guys, I know it's early, but it really feels like Avery Davis' injury could be a bigger impact than initially thought. His ability to get open early will be missed. I mean, look, I would have rather had him doing the things that they had Matt Salerno doing. So, yes, if their game plan was to use a veteran player to do those things, then, yeah, and not having Avery hurt them. But to me, again, that's more of a coaching problem than it is a player problem. Yes, Avery Davis is going to hurt you early, Jason, and I think your point is correct. But my whole point is you're right, though. It is early. Guys are growing into roles that up until the first couple weeks of fall camp, Avery was handling. But I don't think that's the reason they lost. Because if they had to run the same game plan on Saturday and Avery Davis played in it, it doesn't make 1 ounce of difference, in my opinion. Not one. Yeah. It just doesn't. So I think it was a game plan. Like Matt Salerno played like 8 or 9 snaps on Saturday. And he got targeted too much, one time too many. But he made a heck of a play on the one time he was targeted. Maybe Avery makes that catch. Maybe Avery doesn't make that catch, but he makes the later one instead of getting an offensive pass interference. Well, the reality is you only got 3 points if he doesn't make that other catch because Salerno's first catch set up a touchdown, right? I mean, so I just don't think – and, again, the other guys were getting open. Like, here's a comment that D-Rock90 said, and yes, the offensive game plan failed, but more concerning is that they didn't adjust. That's what is concerning me. This is why you need to go listen to our Upon Further Review from Sunday night, D-Rock. They did make adjustments. We went through it, and I didn't see a ton of adjustments live, but this is why we do Upon Further Review. We do Upon Further Review because you can go back and look at things and say, hey, I watched the game, and that's not kind of how it played out live, right? And there were adjustments in the second half. They spread the field a little bit more formationally in the second half. They took more shots down the field in the second half. They did some different things like that where they tried to isolate guys on the nickels and the safeties, which ended up getting guys open, but the protection wasn't there. So there were adjustments. We went through them. We broke them down. There was a lot more adjustments than I thought watching it live, but they weren't executed. And so it's like the Oklahoma State game. Oh, they didn't make any adjustments in the second half. Yes, they did. They made adjustments. They just didn't work. Now, you can argue and say and be critical of, well, the adjustments you made didn't work. That's fair. And that's a very fair criticism. Because again, it's one thing to draw up a pass play that you think is going to work, but if you can't protect it, then it's not an effective play, right? And they weren't able to protect. So, I would say if you want to say that, D-Rock, like the adjustments didn't work, that's fine. But they definitely made adjustments in the second half. They ended up being ineffective adjustments because the offensive line played as poorly as it did and couldn't protect the quarterback. You could also maybe say there was different adjustments you would have liked to see. We've had this conversation. We've talked about that. There was different things I would have liked to have seen them do that they didn't do. Very fair conversation. Like why not, if you're going to use Tyree on Jets, why not, and they're playing a lot of cover one, why not run just darts across the field and then bring Tyree up on a wheel route, make someone climb over top and run with him? Like there's things that you could have done against what Ohio State was doing that I would have done, but they didn't do them. But they still made adjustments. They just weren't necessarily the ones that I personally would have made. That's my point. That's my point. All right, Marcher 452 with a mailbag question: Who should have been the bell cow? Who should be the bell cow moving forward? How many snaps should Salerno see in comparison to Styles, Lindsey, Colsey, Thomas, and Merriweather? So, I don't believe in a bell cow back. I don't. Especially when you have Audric Estime, Chris Tyree, and Logan Diggs. If you have a bell cow back, two of those guys are going to be very unhappy. Number one, but more importantly, you're not using two really talented football players, and so I don't believe they need a bell cow back. Georgia in 2017 with Nick Chubb was not their bell cow. He wasn't. They balanced the carries out, and we've pointed this out before. And so I want to see them using all of their weapons. What I don't want to see, however, is they all three run distinctly different plays when they're in the game.
Yes,
I didn't love. To be honest with you. So I want to see a better balance of using Chris Tyree in the run game more, and then maybe using Audric Estime a little bit more in the pass game, especially if you're just going to have him pass block. Like there were times where you just saw Chris Tyree step up and pass block. I'm like, that needs to be Audric Estime or Logan Diggs doing that. They're bigger bodied guys. So Ryan, this next one's for you. Next couple are for you. And he asked, what did you see from Bo Bauer in the last game? John A1 says, and he had a really nice hit early, but do you think he showed a better feel for the game in comparison to his pass play?
It looked kind of the same to me, Brian. I don't know if you got different vibes for it, but nope. I think it's hit or miss with Bo Bauer, man. Like there's some times where I think he's a little bit of a guesser. I don't think he's a really proactive football player. I think there's some times where he makes a good read and he's just going to kind of work his way and hit a gap and make a nice play. And then there's other plays where he's just going to hit the wrong gap or he's going to be out of position. Like that's kind of what I saw. And honestly, not to be overly critical of Bo Bauer here, but I also saw the same situation with Maris Loifau. I saw that at times, like there's a little bit of guessing at times and there's over aggressiveness to a degree, right? So I don't think that that's just a Bo Bauer issue. I think that was a linebacker issue at times during that football game. So, but to answer the question, I think that it was still relatively the same to me. I think that there's a little bit of guessing that happens. I just don't know if Bo is ever going to be a really proactive football player. Like I just don't know if he'll ever be that type of guy. But yeah. He can run, he can hit. So there's going to be a role for him. It's just might have to simplify that role a little bit.
Yeah. I agree. I just think he kind of is what he is at this point in time. Then Irish Chi-Town asked, Ryan, are there any recruits visiting this weekend? There are going to be some recruits on campus. And this is why you need to be on the message board, because there's one recruit in particular who will be here this weekend. And it is a very, very, very important recruit, Ryan. So why don't you go ahead and talk to the people about the visit that Notre Dame's going to be getting this weekend.
Yeah, I mean, so if you're on the message board or you're on the podcast regularly, this shouldn't be like breaking news. It was something that I kind of hinted at a few weeks ago, but Jeremiah Love, 2023 running back out of Christian Brothers in St. Louis, Missouri, is going to be on campus this week. It's going to be a big opportunity, I think, for Notre Dame to potentially close this one if everything goes really well, if we're being honest, right? He's a kid that wanted to get his mom back on campus to meet the coaches, to be able to sit down, break bread was, I think, the term that he used with me, or the situation, just kind of to meet them, because she hasn't gotten a chance to get on campus. The first time that he went on campus, she had to work. The second time she was recovering from COVID, so she hasn't had a chance to meet the coaches for Notre Dame. So big opportunity to have Jeremiah Love back on campus. There's other 2024 players that don't have offers right now that are the kind of the guys that we have put onto the board that have been verified for this game. But the big one to know, as Brian kind of alluded to, is that Jeremiah Love, top running back target, top offensive target in general, left on the board for Notre Dame, will be on campus for the Marshall game.
We're going to answer a couple more questions. Look, there's a lot of good questions. We are going to have a mailbag tonight with Vince. A lot of the questions you have now, bring them tonight with Vince. So Vince and I will be doing the mailbag together. I just got confirmation from him that he is going to that he is going to have me on tonight. So a lot of those we'll bring up tonight. Couple things here before we move on. John A1, do you think playing against bigger players was a problem for Zeke Correll? Do you think it's something he can adjust to? He's been practicing against guys his size or smaller all offseason. The size of the players he's going up against is a problem because of the stuff we've talked about. Mm-hmm. Zeke Correll is smaller-ish than other guys, but Zeke Correll's over 300 pounds. Yeah. His height is actually an advantage for him as a center, which is why you usually see centers that are a little shorter and stubbier. I mean, it's
natural leverage.
It's natural leverage, right? But you lose that the minute this is the whole point. The minute you stop moving your feet, you lose that leverage. That leverage is gone, right? It is. And so that's the thing that Zeke needs to do a better job of. That's why you've got to move your feet and drive and really fight. And that's why Harry Heasan practices that every single day, because he understands the minute an offensive lineman stops moving his feet, he's going to lose against a player that's any good at all. And that's what's happening. So it's especially problematic when you're playing bigger players. It gets magnified even more, but it's not that he's just getting out there getting chucked around. Zeke's over 300 pounds. He's not just getting tossed around because he's small, right? He's getting beat because he's not moving his feet. If he starts moving his feet, Zeke will play better. He will. He's a strong kid. He's an athletic kid for his size. He needs to move his feet and use his hands better. Do that, and he'll be a better player, no matter the size of the guys he's going against, in my opinion.
And when you're a little bit of a smaller guy, to your point, Brian, like you need to have better technique. You know, like if you don't have good technique, then that's where it becomes an issue. But as long as Zeke Correll keeps good technique, he should be a successful football player. I mean, but that's not just consistent to him. That's like any player that's a little undersized. You have to win off of technique. And last game was not great technique. It needs to be better.
Yep. And we have here, too, a question from Archer following up to a comment I made. He says, Brian, couldn't that be an argument against Reese as an OC? Looked great on offense for one game last year, and then the offense disappeared. The offense disappeared over the next month is what we're referring to. So we've talked about this before, Archer, before you jumped on our channel. The big complaint we had last year was Brian Kell was way too involved early, and the offensive line struggled. By the end of the year, Kelly had kind of backed off, and Reese got to do things the way he wanted. And the competition went down, and the offense was a lot better. The offense down the stretch was way better than it was early. And that was when Tommy was kind of doing some of the things that we liked that gave us optimism about what he was going to do. It all kind of goes back to having a head coach that's a little bit too influential in what and how you have to go about your business. And I don't know if it's because he's young, and so coaches think that they have to be more involved in it or not. I don't know the answer to that. I'm not in those meetings. I just know that when they kind of let him do his thing, his offenses have been pretty good for the most part. And so that's what I kind of want to see moving forward. So it's a fair counterpoint, but it was over the next month. Once they kind of got past USC, and an offense moved the ball pretty well against USC. They had some really stupid drops. Like first drive of the game, they got a field goal. Kevin Austin drops a crossing route that he probably catches and scores. If he doesn't drop it, they had some other dumb stuff like that cost them from really blowing USC out. But North Carolina, I mean, every time North Carolina scored, the offense would just answer. You know, and then just they blew out Georgia Tech, blew out Navy. They won their last two games by a combined score of 100-14. And it wasn't against it wasn't like where, you know, well, yeah, you beat Auburn 30-10, but then you scored 70 against Savannah State, right? I mean, they played against Georgia Tech and Stanford. That's still Power 5 football teams. And they won 100-14 in their last two games last year. So it's a fair question if you don't quite understand the whole context of the season, which I'm not expecting you to, Archer, because I mean you're an Ohio State fan, so it's not a criticism, it's just reality. But that's something that we did talk about. Then the last question is from Ladarius, Ryan. I thought this was an interesting one. Michael S., what's the chance that this is a Ball State kind of game? It won't be. That Ball State game was one of the dumbest things I've ever seen. You will not see Marcus Freeman practicing his third and fourth strings this week in practice like they did that week. So no, it will not be like that. It will. I'm
trying to remember how that game went.
It's 24-16. It was. I don't even want to talk about it.
I do remember.
Ladarius Martin says, Brian and Ryan, who wins Alabama 2020 squad or LSU 2019 squad? I think LSU 2019 wins by double digits.
Yes.
And look, let me just state my case why.
Yeah.
I think the Alabama offense in 2019 was phenomenal. I think that defense was mediocre at best. And in they just were. I mean, this is a team that gave up 48 points to Ole Miss and couldn't stop the run. This is a team that gave up just got absolutely destroyed by Kyle Trask. Kyle Trask. Now, I think the game would have looked a lot like it did in 2019 when they played in 2019 in Tuscaloosa. It would have been a close game, a high-scoring game, but one where LSU controlled the whole game. And Alabama kind of came back late. LSU jumped out to a big lead. Alabama came back. I think the LSU defense in 2019 was better than, and I know that our resident Alabama fan disagrees with that, but I think that defense was better. I think Alabama benefited from some COVID stuff that year, to be completely honest with you. Their yards per play were almost identical, but to me, I thought LSU by the end of the year was playing at a level that I've never seen a team play, in my opinion.
Well, down the stretch, LSU's defense played really well. Early on in the season, like middle part of the season, there were some hiccups, but like down the
stretch,
gave
up 530 to Texas in game 2.
Right.
Yes, correct. 457 against Florida. They gave up a lot against Ole Miss, but then 304 against Arkansas, 169 against A&M, held Georgia to 286, held Oklahoma to 322, and then held Clemson to 394. So, I mean, when it mattered most, that defense played really well. Where when you look at the Alabama defense, they got shredded in the SEC title game. Shredded. I mean, Kyle Trask ripped them apart that game.
Yeah.
And with all due respect to Kyle Trask and Kyle Pitts and Antonio, what's his name? The Tony kid was in that game too.
Kadarius
Tony. They're not Jamar Chase and Justin Jefferson, and that team was so loaded, with all due respect. So
the best offense I've ever seen in college football is that 2019 LSU team. That was my immediate one too, Brian, is like, I think it would have been a shootout, and I'll take Joe Burrow in that historic season because that was the best I've ever seen an offense play. So I'll take Joe Burrow.
And their defense was not great that year, but they made plays when they needed to make plays.
Right. Opportunistic.
Right. Yep. Yes, very much so. Very much so. So that is going to do it for today's show. Great questions, everybody. We are going to be back tomorrow. Like I said, tomorrow we'll be back at 1 o'clock for our Keys to the Game. Tonight, 6 p.m. Eastern Time, IB Nation Sports Talk. It'll be Vince and me doing a mailbag. So we're going to dive into the mailbag tonight. It's going to be a lot of fun. I think you guys enjoy it. If I didn't get to your question here today, I appreciate you. Please bring it tonight at 6 p.m. So we'll start our show a little after 6. That's how we do. We want to give people as much time as they can to get into the channel, and then we'll get started. So make sure you check that out. I'll have my midweek musings out here in a little bit. Got lots more analysis on at irishbreakdown.com. Sign up for the message boards. And hey, we're putting a lot of content now on the CFB Nation channel. So our podcast is putting stuff up. So I put 3 podcasts up today from the Sporting News guys. So it's the CFB All-America podcast. They kind of recapped some of the big games of week 1. They did a preview of the big games from week 2. They also do like a confidence pick. So like the games that they're most confident in. That's some very interesting ones. I had a very interesting take on the Michigan-Hawaii game. So one of the guys took Hawaii with the points, because it's a 51-point spread. And they're just like, yeah, that's an absurd spread, So it was a really interesting discussion and argument. Of course, they talked about Alabama, Texas quite a bit. So make sure you guys are checking that out. Our YouTube channel is over 1,000 subscribers, but we're nowhere close to 4,000 watch hours, which is what we need to get monetized. So definitely, if y'all can help us out there, spread the word to your other college football fans. We've had some recruiting stuff going up there from John Garcia Jr. We've put our predictions that we make on our Friday show on that channel. So CFB Nation on YouTube and CFB Nation on your podcast. Make sure you're checking those out. It's a way for you. It's not a Notre Dame channel. It's Irish Breakdown's college football channel. We felt that it was better to talk college football on that channel than to have it here, where it kind of would overlap with the stuff we're doing. So make sure you're subscribed. You can find it on Apple Podcast. You can find it on Spotify. It's a CFB Nation. It's the red, white, and blue logo. So definitely make sure that you follow that. And then, of course, on our YouTube channel. So check all of that stuff out. We appreciate y'all very much. Like this podcast, subscribe to our channel, hit the notification bell, share this podcast, sign up for the message boards at boards.irishbreakdown.com. And remember, tailgate Saturday. We'll be in the stadium lot. I just got the okay that they're sending me the passes. So we'll be in the stadium lot. So we'll be like right in front of the Notre Dame Stadium in there tailgating. had a little bit of a family emergency coming up on my family. My parents said they're still going to plan on coming. They may not be able to. Unfortunately, we'll see how it's going to go. But either way, we're going to have some fun. We're going to be there. We're going to have some food there. It's going to be a lot of fun. So hopefully by Friday, I'll know for sure if my parents are going to be there, because they'll already be on their way and be here. But just keep my family in your thoughts and prayers. I don't want to get into it because it's not my business to tell right now. But one of my close family members is in the hospital right now. So back in Virginia. So just keep them in your thoughts and prayers. I'd really appreciate that very, very much. So have a great rest of your day, everybody. And hopefully I'll see some of y'all in about 3 hours on the IB Nation Sports Talk show for our mailbag tonight with V and Vince. Have a good one, everybody. Talk to you soon.